first time I read an Eric LaRocca book, it made me so angry that I made this YouTube channel. Now, just like my priest when I came out, I'm not surprised, I'm just disappointed. If you like horror novels, or you like being horrified by how bad this one is, or you just like to listen to people complain about stuff you have no involvement in, stick around. If you're new here, my name is Ambrose, and welcome to castleguytv, where you can expect bitchy book reviews and media commentary meant to make us both more conscientious readers and writers.
That sign can't stop me, because I can't read!
If you're an OG follower of the channel, you'll know that our inaugural video in February was on Eric LaRocca's melodramatic full-length novel debut at Dark I Become Loathsome. A certified stinker so smelly, it's the reason that we've been able to keep these irons burning for 6 months strong. I had no intention of reviewing another one of Eric LaRocca's books, but when I saw that the main character of this book shares a name with a character from my own dark fantasy work in progress, curiosity got the best of me. Now I kind of want to change the name. Today's read is Wretch, or The Unbecoming of Porcelain Khaw. This will be our second review in the Eric LaRocca cinematic universe. Now you might be wondering, is really just the name of a character enough to get me to read a book that I know I'm not going to like? Yes, but there's more. Anyone who knows me IRL will know that my favorite movie of all time is Suspiria 2018. And unfortunately, I am one of those people that was really into Radiohead in high school, and Tom York did the soundtrack, so really I was done for from the start. The movie also takes inspiration from the same whack prose poem that I've taken inspiration from for my own work in progress. It's vaguely Catholic, there's political commentary, there's witches. Imagine my surprise when I'm opening up this book. I get through the prologue, and I am jump scared by this, out of context, unflinchingly edgy pull from the tail end of the movie, which has to do with the politics of post-World War II Berlin in contrast to the politics of a coven that is currently being led by a false prophet, not knowing that they are witnessing the rise of their original chief source of power incarnate in the form of the main character. Huh? I read that quote and I was like, no, 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 absolutely not. No one fucks with my baby. Okay? And then I screamed into my pillow and decided that after a pretty substantial reading slump while my life has been exploding, I had to do another video on this motherfucker. The quote doesn't even relate to anything in the book. It's whack. It's really fucking whack. If you couldn't tell, my first time reviewing an Eric LaRocca book didn't leave a great first impression on me. I thought it was overwritten, impossibly edgy, and poorly structured, among many other things. This is coming from someone who wrote the majority of this video while listening to industrial and darkwave mixes, wearing Hellraiser socks, and drinking Monster Ultra Black from a wine glass pretending that it's fizzy blood. I know ball. I'm going to a goth show soon. I've got eyeliner in my bathroom. If I'm punching sideways. While we can argue that this is a bad faith review, which it kinda is, have faith in me and know that I'm an informed hater, and we will be talking about all the bad and the good in this review, from inventive concepts to god-awful execution. So let's dive in. Let's dive into our content warnings. Ghosts, occult rituals, suicidal ideation, grief, self-harm, body horror, death, sexual violence, child neglect, emotional abuse, child slavery, implied pedophilia, cheating, gore, terminal illness, fatphobia, misogyny, orientalism, anti-sex work language, discussions of speculated racism, bugs, bore, kinda, and intense moments of secondhand cringe. Alright gang, let's start with our publisher blurb. From rising horror star and award-winning author of Things Have Gotten Worse Since We Last Spoke, comes a nightmarish, haunting, tech-gothic thrill ride about sorrow, memory, and the unabashed complexity of love as a transgressive act. After his husband dies, Simeon Link finds himself overcome by grief and seeking comfort in an unusual support group called the Wretches, who offer an addictive and dangerous source of relief. They introduced Simeon to a curious figure known as Porcelain Khaw, a man with the ability to let those who are grieving have one last intimate moment with their beloved. Dot, 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 for a price. Hallucinatory, fiendish, and destructively beautiful, Wretch transports us to a world where not everything is as it seems, and those we love may be the ones who haunt us the most. Brother. That description is not accurate at all, by the way, just so you know. Wretch is separated into 5 parts. A prologue titled Reverse Haunting, Part 1, Simeon, Part 2, Predator and Prey, and Part 3, Porcelain, followed by our ending, Haunted. Each of the main 3 parts is 4 chapters long. Before this is a dedication to Clive Barker, whom he's been compared to in the past, but I don't really get it beyond sadomasochistic overtones, personally. If you're unaware, Clive Barker is the brain behind The Hellbound Heart and all its subsequent titles, which are the source material for the Hellraiser movies. As I'm recording this, I'm wearing pinhead socks. I know, ball. I usually don't go this deep into front or back matter in our plot sections, but I want you to remember the epigraph here. A Clive Barker quote saying, quote, "Nothing else wounds so deeply and irreparably. Nothing else robs us of hope so much as being unloved by one we love." Tuck that into the back of your mind, we'll come back to it. Let's look at this prologue. Just like Eric LaRocca's naming schemes for his books, the sections are equally overly precious and have their own melodramatic epigraphs if one wasn't enough. Don't get me wrong, I think epigraphs can be really interesting when done right. The question is, does it really add anything? You can decide for yourself. Reverse Haunting's epigraph, an uncredited one, meaning it's a LaRocca original, reads, quote, "Every living thing, no matter how small, no matter how hollow and crude, is a kind of mirror. We recognize all the painful, abhorrent parts of ourselves by seeing them reflected in others." I can practically smell the coffee-stained breath of the mediocre MFA student quoting this on Instagram. Don't worry though, because the real first line is way more purple. Quote, "There's a remarkable carnage, a swift kind of cruelty, a haughty sort of viciousness, thrumming beneath the blighted, rotting sinew of the world." How many times are we gonna do this, man? There's an adjective noun meaning the same thing, an adjective noun meaning the same thing, blah 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 blah, moving on. Quote, "I feel it in the air, in the stone steps, in the frame of the small red brick house with the roof tiled in dark gray shingles that I stand in front of. Why have I come here? I wonder to myself as the door pulls back and a man appears there in a suit so sharp it could cut. He eyes me up and down, quietly eviscerating my willpower. I want only to be a loyal subject, to become a kind of servant the way all women must submit themselves before men, to be possessed." Ma'am? Are we okay? One, I hate when people say, "I wonder to myself, I think to myself," etc. And I have a good reason. Apologies for already getting us down a tangent, but no one thinks to themselves. They just think. Moreover, writing out that modifier of "to myself" or "to himself" if you're doing third person does what we call filtering, and it reduces the immediacy between the reader and the prospective character. Some authors will utilize this on purpose to indicate an unreliable or overly distant narrator, but this is not the case at any point in this book. It's just a novice move in an attempt to be overly voicey. Now, back to the women submitting themselves to men part. I don't know, man. I don't know. I don't have enough data on LaRocca writing female characters' points of view to know if he's weird about women yet, but what fucking century is this? Out the gate, I get that they're trying to, again, put forth some sort of sadomasochistic overtones, but to what end? Anyway, our narrator for this portion, which we don't learn until literally the end, but I'll say now for simplicity, is Genevieve Doyle, and she's with us only for this chapter. Genevieve, who sounds a lot like Eric LaRocca, goes on and on about the ways a human can be possessed, not just by spirits. Quote, "A human can be owned, just like any other object of desire," said every colonizer ever. But Genevieve continues, completely breaking up what little action exists to talk about how it can also be nice to belong to someone else. but also sometimes not. Real big thinker. She gives us, with absolutely no description of how or why she feels this way, the conclusion that, from the way the man she's encountering glares at her, judging it to be with cruel intentions, she can tell that he's, quote, expecting to annihilate her with a mere flick of his wrist. If he could simply command the tide of blood swelling inside her to finally burst, she knows that he would. Because this is a normal thing to expect of a stranger who at this point doesn't look like anything. Genevieve is early for the time she and this guy agreed upon. Apparently, they've been emailing back and forth, and he's been really curt and impersonal, which has led her to believe that he's not a real person and might be, quote, a frightened or lovelorn spirit. Very poetic, but contextually meaningless. She hands him her phone, which is part of the agreement that she gives it up. She's wondering if the mystery man has ever heard of something called a reverse haunting, which is exactly what it sounds like, the living haunting. I'll give credit to LaRocca that I actually like this idea, but that's about as far as the credit's going to go. Genevieve goes on for like 2 whole pages of yap about the concept and musings on if ghosts only exist because the living want them to, etc. It's giving tulpas or thought forms, if you know, you know. But again, it's just her musings, nothing actually happened. She even yaps about how she believes one can even own a ghost, I guess. And she really wants to haunt the ghosts. She says, quote, "The truth is this, I wish to haunt them. The insistent presence in the dimly lit corner with teeth gnashing, eyeballs widening, hands curling to fists, hair prickling and standing on end. I'm the pain of this world, and they are the fortunate ones without hunger, without craving, without injury." Girl, be for real. Mystery Man is essentially a receptionist for a different mystery man who's in a room down a pathway that is surrounded by silver beetles that might be reminiscent of a scarab if you squint real hard. In order to channel her dead husband, Genevieve brought a token of emotional significance for a ritual of some sort where she's already musing on how she feels like she might not come back, which frankly tells us that's exactly what's going to happen and cuts away a lot of the tension. Paragraphs of description and thinking pass before we actually get to the room with the dude who is initially described as a, quote, middle-aged man dressed entirely in white. He looks utterly distinctive yet completely unremarkable at the same time. His hair is dark and his eyes are dimmed, glassy, reflective, almost like an ornately decorated bowl made of fine china. He's very trim, but not sickly looking. There's nothing noteworthy about his appearance that she might be able to recall when she finally leaves this room. In fact, he resembles almost a bewildering kind of vessel, a container she could place all her sadness inside, a depository, a sort of reliquary to inherit all her most undesirable longings. Holy synonyms. He's sitting on a giant bed with red sheets. He's described as looking angelic and that he moves like some, quote, celestial guard. Genevieve describes feeling lassoed by the waist. The walls are bare, by the way. Keep this in mind for later. Mystery Man asks if they should begin, and when asked how, Genevieve goes on and on about how it's too late for that, and, quote, the invocation has already been issued. The dance has already begun. Mystery Man corners her and says that there are many ways that this can happen, and Genevieve, after asking why, says she senses her throat sealing shut like he commanded it so, and that he's capable of magic. His answer? Quote, "Because you're going to have to suffer." Dun dun dun! Smash cut to a forum post of a news article to a local message board called the Grim Laurels, reporting that Genevieve Doyle went missing, and in the comments at the very end, someone says, quote, "They'll never find her. She's with Porcelain now." Aside from the overlong, unrelated yaps, this isn't like an awful opening by any means, but I felt like LaRocca was and is in general very trigger happy when it comes to disclosing information to the reader. Did we really need to be told several times that it's too late for her if we were always going to get this news article? I don't think so. Anyway, yay, part 1. From now on, we will be reading from the perspective of Simeon, who is like Ashley Luton from At Dark I Become Loathsome, but reskinned. We'll get into why in the analysis later, but But I recommend checking that video out as well if you really want to get immersed in the larocca cinematic universe. Part 1 opens with ya boy Simeon sitting in a bathroom stall at his office job holding a razor blade to his fingertips, thinking of ending things. In Minecraft, before YouTube kills me. Dear God, I think to myself, carefully sliding my index finger along the sharp edge of the razor while I squat on the lid of the toilet seat. This is no way to live. No fucking way to live indeed. ... Our narrator says, yapping further down the next paragraph about how dark and twisted his mind is. Quote, I've learned this after years of noticing my mind become more and more polluted, the more upsetting and baleful thoughts taking root easier and spreading further until I'm infected. Yes, infected. Perhaps all human thought is a kind of infection, a sort of unseen disease that rots you from the inside out if you're not careful enough. The app doesn't end there, but these are the kind of edgy, quotable little one-offs that do big numbers on the quotation boards on Goodreads and are why this author somehow manages to maintain notoriety. Simeon continues droning on, fantasizing about doing something drastic because his life is a waste, with little strange add-ons like how he always thought that life for a gay man ended at 30. Someone comes and knocks at the bathroom door because if you recall, Simeon's been hogging the public workplace restroom, which if you're a chronic tummy trouble haver like me, you'll know is evil incarnate. Apparently he's pulled this shit before, no pun intended, enough that he's literally been written up for it. Fuck this guy. Anyway, his boss wants to see him. Mr. Simeon hasn't been doing too hot at his job ever since his husband died, which, word. But now his boss is voluntelling him to take an indefinite extended leave of absence while the board decides what to do with him. While his title is Administrative Specialist, the talk includes missed deadlines on, quote, certain deliverables, and pushing things back to accommodate Simeon's workflow. He's apparently a big enough fish for this to matter to the board, but all this talk makes him seem pretty low level, and him only having 5 years in the company nods toward that. Anyway, this leave is supposed to be a few months unpaid. He's cooked, and we all know it, but Mr. Boss Guy says it's for the best. Simeon, in his internal lamentations, says that, and I'm not kidding, everything in this world is a vampire. I can just imagine larocca thinking it clever to type that out because despite all our main character's rage, he is, indeed, still just a rat in a cage. Jesus Christ. Anyway, if you've seen my first larocca review, you might remember our G. Norman Restrick of Restrick & Sons Funeral Home. We get haunted briefly by his ghost when Mr. Boss Guy says, "You need to find new meaning, dear boy. Connect with others. Go out and meet people. Be sociable. It will change your life. ... Can larocca please learn to write more than 4 different stock characters? Simeon notices in the middle of this a photo of a hemlock grove on his boss's desk and compliments it, and it looks like no one is in the photo. But Mr. Boss Guy says that the photo is of his wife, who Simeon knows died several years prior, which makes Simeon shiver before he goes to collect his things. Throughout all of this first chapter, I think the phrase "make my way" as a filler transition is used at least 3 or 4 times, and all the while Simeon prattles on about the freedom of death. Yippee. Chapter 2. Simeon's collected his stuff, right? Yes, but it still takes us over 2 pages for him to actually step outside of his office building because he spends so much time yapping about how horrible and awful and surreal it is, and how he feels like a sleepwalker, a pitiable, pathetic thing that doesn't realize he's dreaming, etc., etc., and it's sunny out, which feels like an insult, and when he does finally get outside, he finds a large rat with its stomach torn open and being eaten by another rat. And this, of course, reflects the internal reality of our narrator, who says outright 2 paragraphs later, after a graphic description of the feast, quote, "Cannibals. Yes," he thinks, "the world is filled with cannibals." It's also a vampire, lest you forget. So Simeon gets home. He microwaves some leftover mac and cheese and decides to go on to, quote, certain websites. Forums dedicated to bored housewives contemplating affairs with their electrician, businessmen sourcing opinions from anonymous users on the craftsmanship of their new neckties, but his favorites are the ones to do with people's dreams. He's on Reddit. This book is set in 2025. Just say Reddit, we all know. The Dream Warrior forum, however, is the one that he goes to, and he comes upon a post called, quote, "The Ordeal of Porcelain Khaw." He wonders if he should even bother reading it, but there's a larocca classic, an inexplicable force, that draws him to read it. While it's not as egregious as At Dark I Become Loathsome, once again, larocca has decided that we need to have entire short stories inserted into the book. At least this one is actually relevant. Now, it never comes back up again, but I want to point out that this forum post opens with, quote, "In my dreams, I think of a book I once read, a collection of Middle Eastern folktales called 1001 Nights. I don't know why I think about this book, especially while I sleep, blah blah blah." This is important not because of the plot, but because while no distinctive features are described for Porcelain Khaw, he continually gets placed next to Middle Eastern, Southwest Asian, or North African imagery, and that is very important to this reading of the book. This forum post dream sequence is narrated by a woman who is invited to the house of Porcelain Khaw in a country other than our own, where alongside her husband they intend to discuss a business deal concerning jams and jellies. It's very clear that the host and the husband are hiding something from the woman. Porcelain is wealthy and able to offer a feast during tea. The narrator and the husband come from poverty, and they have a son. In an effort to provide for the son and themselves, it's revealed that the husband intends to offer the son up as an indentured servant of sorts, where it's assured that he will be cared for. What are the child's responsibilities? Who's to say? The husband doesn't care, but the narrator does, and starts grilling Porcelain and the husband, and it's revealed that the husband has already signed the child away. The invitation for tea was a formality to try to coax the wife into signing. But really, there was nothing to be done, and Porcelain was asking all these really questionable questions. Like, if the boy was docile, if he had pubic hair yet, all of which sound like things certain people who go on registries might ask. Our narrator gets this too, and so she starts freaking out. The boy's responsibilities, though, are to tend to Porcelain's every need, but most importantly, because of this country's sheer number of insects, the boy's chief duty will be to walk around covered in jelly so that the bugs will target him instead of Porcelain, and to assuage the narrator's reservations, insists that similar practices were done in ancient Egypt, and that other peers of Porcelain have begun to do the same thing. The narrator doesn't buy it though, and asks Porcelain directly what he intends to do with her son, which he says he intends to, quote, "dismantle her precious boy, crack him apart like an eggshell, expose his soft, pink innards, and gorge on all that remains until he's completely empty and useless to anyone else." And she asks him, and I quote, "When you're torturing him slowly, will you remember to remind him that his mother will always love him?" Which receives no answer. This little story also includes some banger lines like, quote, "I sense something raking itself through the meat of my viscera," to describe her stomach lurching, and a lot of the description is like that. I need larocca to work on his dialogue scenes because there are so many ways you can portray emotion without doing these overwritten lines that don't really give us a real image. The scene also could have been pared down quite a bit. Things get restated over and over, like the narrator's suspicions that sex is part of the motivation for this arrangement, which gets brought up at least 4 or 5 times, including in a way that tells the reader how to interpret things before they're given any time to come to that conclusion on their own, which was annoying. Anyway, that section was almost 30 pages. Legit. At the very end, Simeon finds a comment that says, quote, ... "Porcelain Khaw's a real person, or rather, real thing, ... an ageless entity, a cosmic furnace, ... I think he visits you in your dreams, ... So many fucking ellipses, oh my god." And of course, Simeon has to be secretly drawn to this name. It feels, quote, "so hideously inevitable, and when he whispers it out loud, he senses himself crimp a little, bend in ways like he's being ordered into submission." Next chapter. It wouldn't be a larocca book without an awkward chat log. Once again, Simeon is getting into trouble online. This time, he's in the Grim Laurels chat group, which might or might not be related to the Grim Laurels forum, who knows. And he joins the same time as Babyface XOXO. Simeon has his full government name as his screen name, which is a downgrade from At Dark I Become Loathsome, where our protagonist chose Sad Boy. Simeon is looking to relieve himself sexually with someone else on a group chat that hasn't been identified to my knowledge as being for that purpose. But this person asks if he wants to chat, and he says, "You a guy or a girl?" This person, Babyface XOXO, whose identity is important later, kinda, says, quote, "Gender's more complex and nuanced than that, dot dot dot. For fuck's sake, dot dot dot." Simeon says, "Just wanted to know, dot dot dot." Babyface says, "Gender's never an easy thing, even if you're comfortable with what's in between your legs. Gender is never static. It's never just one thing. It's many things, dot dot dot. And nothing, all at once, dot dot dot." This is almost their entire exchange. They go back and forth. Simeon's like, "You act like you know me," and Babyface is like, "If I knew you, I'd make sure you were never comfortable a day in your life. If it weren't for the fact it'd take forever and maybe copyright would bite me, I'd read the whole thing." Long story short, Babyface tips Simeon off to a group called the Wretches, which is a, quote, small, exclusive group that meets in a church every Thursday. They take photographs of inanimate objects to find their loved ones' faces in the pictures. Remember the boss's photo? It's kind of like that. When Simeon asks if there's anything else he should know when he goes to the meeting, Babyface quotes Tennessee Williams, saying, quote, "Don't look forward to the day you stop suffering, because when it comes you'll know you're dead." And both Babyface and Simeon are really edgy about it. The quote, fills Simeon's mind when he takes a shower the following morning. After more lamentations about his beloved, sweet Jonathan, Simeon leaves his apartment to go to a skate park nearby where his ex-wife Evelyn is waiting for him. And when he asks her about their son, she says that he's been asking about Simeon all morning and that he's always excited to see his father. Simeon's son Carter is 16 years old, but the entire situation is written like a 10-year-old being brought to the playground. Evelyn and Simeon briefly discuss his leave of absence, and we get some backstory about Simeon quote-unquote deceiving Evelyn by not telling her he was gay and that he was never attracted to her. Something I find weird about this is that we never get any information as to why Simeon would have knowingly deceived someone and had a whole-ass child with them. Most of the time when someone knows they're gay and get into a straight relationship anyway, it's often for religious or cultural expectations. Otherwise, it's someone realizing this about themselves after the fact, which isn't deception if you also don't know. I think it's that explanation, but with extra self-hatred for flavor. Evelyn invites Simeon to get breakfast with her and Carter before Carter has to go to school. And he makes some excuse and says he doesn't want to interrupt Carter while he's playing, ... Again, the wording makes him sound much younger. Blah blah blah, more lamenting him being a horrible father, how he should be doting and nurturing, and not so subtly, larocca adds, quote, "He's always been such a precocious boy after all. It wouldn't surprise him in the least if he harbored some secret grudge against him, all while dutifully playing the role of the sullen, attention-starved teenager." This part is a little funny also because Carter gets described as being very cheerful and happy only a few paragraphs prior, and he gets literally no dialogue face to face with Simeon to be able to verify if Carter is at all sullen or attention-starved. Simeon, in his internal monologue, describes himself as a disgruntled cocksucker with a hang-up on the man he loved who in turn abandoned him right before his terminal cancer diagnosis. Because it's always cancer in a larocca book. Really don't get it, man. We get more brooding speculations on if Jonathan was ever really cool with the fact that Simeon had a wife, and he thinks back on a memory of him where Simeon describes him being framed by their heart and lingering like some virile specter. To him, Jonathan was godlike, which you might recognize as being how Ashley Luton describes Jinx in At Dark I Become Loathsome. Really nothing burger compliment. He recants an interaction then where Jonathan gets really dodgy when Simeon brings up the prospect of them having their own child together, and Jonathan's like, "Are you sure? What about Evelyn? Maybe we should think about this further down the road when we're ready." It's implied that this is because Jonathan was unhappy or wanting to leave him. I think it could also be said that Jonathan saw Simeon's negligence toward his one child that he does have and thought it was a bad idea to repeat history. We'll never really know. In the timeline of things, only weeks after this memory, Jonathan got diagnosed with brain cancer. Something I'm curious about here is how he got diagnosed and what his symptoms were. You don't just miraculously appear with a brain tumor. Shit has to get weird first. Anyway, Chapter 4. Simeon gets an email from the Wretches group's organization email, which contains essentially a big nothing burger info dump that, like everything else LaRocca writes, reads like his personal voice, which means that the word beloved is used a bajillion times. The email describes the group's purpose as to, quote, provide a safe space for those who are grieving to witness the wonder of the world around them, to recognize the sheer fact that the dead indeed do live on and surround us at all times, and to restructure the way Simeon processes grief with the, quote, enchantment of photography. LaRocca does something that a lot of authors do when they've written themselves into a corner that they personally don't feel like writing themselves out of, which is to make the plot hole gain its own contradictory credence by having the narrator point it out. So Simeon asks the pressing question: why would the Wretches advertise themselves so much if they seem like such an exclusive group? Who knows? We never find out. Nevertheless, Simeon consults the internet for answers and finds an article titled Der Mensch lebt von Illusionen, My Short Time with the Wretches. The first part of the title is German and roughly translates to The People Live on Illusions. Why does this title include German? No clue. I honestly think this is the singular through line between part 1's epigraph being from Suspiria, since it takes place in Germany and includes German being spoken in the movie. That's literally it. Anyway, the article is pretty straightforward and states that the Wretches are nothing but hacks living in illusion, and holding on to those illusions is preferable to the bitter truth. I don't know why we can't just let Simeon sit in his own skepticism before his first meeting, but here we are. Afterwards, Simeon's trying to go to bed, and we get some details about his dreams and more speculations about Jonathan, and he says that in every dream there's some formless specter lingering there, eager to spirit their baby boy away. He also says some things that you can just let wash over you, like, quote, every parent is capable of harming their child. In fact, perhaps it's better for the parent to do so because the world is going to be too eager to harm what you've created. I suppose that wouldn't matter much to me and Jonathan, considering two men cannot conceive naturally. And at the end, he says he dreams of, quote, sweet Jonathan, of the child they never had, and a soulless figure, his skin shiny and reflective like a freshly polished mirror, begging to claim our boy as his. He holds out a contract for me to sign, to will away the life of his precious boy. He shoves the pen aside and refuses to print his name on the line. He would never let his son be devoured.
Guys, do we think that's porcelain? Guys?
Anyway, part 2. Give it up for part 2. Predator and Prey. This part's epigraph comes from The Tenant, a 1976 film with the quote, tell me, at what precise moment does an individual stop being who he thinks he is? Our resident edgelord, as he's driving to the meeting with the Wretches, regales us in his meditations on the phrase coup de grace, a French phrase for a mercy killing. I've noticed LaRocca has a tendency to open little speeches like this as, quote, there's this phrase I learned in XYZ, there's this book I read about XYZ, there's this blog post I read about XYZ, etc., etc. And I feel like LaRocca thinks this is somehow profound or gives off an air of intellectualism, but more often than not, what gets referenced is pretty mundane and unimpressive, and seems more like he wasn't quite sure where to start with a chapter and just thought of a cool thing he read recently to throw in there. He applies the notion of the coup de grace, wondering if there's a cosmic execution for those who've suffered enough because he's too frightened to end things permanently himself. At the end of this segment, he says, quote, "I wonder if I'll discover the person brave enough to help me here tonight, to issue that final blow, to help a poor, defenseless fawn with a leaking wound." And the note I wrote next to that was, "Who up leaking they wound right now?" Welcome to my sick and twisted mind, guys. Simeon's looking for babyface XOXO and can't find them, but mentioning them is enough to get him through the door. There's a giant wooden statue of Jesus with shiny silver eyes in the room, and next to the statue is, quote, "an oil portrait of a young man," or at least I presume it's a young man. To be truthful, I cannot adequately tell. I squint, struggling to examine the person's face, and it's at that moment that I realize the paint has been smudged where the figure's face is supposed to be. A handprint and a shapely swirl defiling the image and covering the area where the young man's face once was. He's dressed in angelic white, and he's sitting at the edge of a sprawling bed with both arms outstretched to the viewer, welcoming them to his sparsely lit chamber. I glance at the gilded plate at the bottom of the frame in hopes of learning the piece's title, but the damn thing has been filed away, scratched by something. Obviously it's porcelain, but why the painting is there in a church, or why the statue of Jesus has silver eyes? Fuck if I know, dude. Simeon is self-conscious about the many people gathering around this meeting, and refers to them as, quote, "these strange and beguiling people," which are two of larocca's favorite adjectives to smush together. Sweet lord. A middle-aged man that Simeon describes as something not quite human, something almost uncannily human but not familiar with any of the characteristics that make a fully formed person, rises up to address the group, and Simeon decides to name him Void. Why is this guy like this? No clue. Will we find out? Nope. Void has a guy come up and present his most recent photo. This guy shows a storm cloud of some sort, and Simeon doesn't really get it, but with the following photo, he does see this dude's dead wife. There's some discussion, yada yada yada, and then Void has Simeon introduce himself, and the crowd is real tough. They continue on with people giving presentations, and at the end, Void unsubtly nudges Simeon to bring a photo the following week. As he's heading out, he meets a young man named Kent who resembles the types of guys that Simeon would have hooked up with before he got married, who lost their novelty when he, quote, "realized that you could be monogamous and gay at the same time." Okay, dude. Anyway, Kent offers to help Simeon with getting set up for fully participating in the Wretches by assisting him in getting a real, legitimate camera for taking photos. Kent gives him a business card, and that's that. Next chapter. Larocca really has a knack for writing needless filler. He just has to describe every transition from scene to scene, even if it doesn't actually push the plot. But to make matters worse, when he describes himself making his way into his apartment, because it's always making his way, good fucking lord, he mentions, quote, "instead, I find myself curling inward," in reference to Kent's offer. Quote, "thankfully, the small elevator is empty, and I thank God I won't be forced to make unnecessary small talk with any neighbors. Eventually, I arrive at my designated floor, and I hasten down the lengthy corridor until I'm at the doorway to my apartment. I fish inside my pocket for the keys, pull them out, and then twist them into the lock, heaving the door open until I'm finally in my safe space." Brother, did we really need to get all that detail to get into the fucking apartment, unironically? Jeez. Simeon's considering playing a self-help tape. Again, this is 2025. He's already on Reddit. Don't know why he isn't using YouTube or a podcast or something, but whatever, pop off, I guess. He's considering heating up takeout. He's thinking about if Evelyn has been replaced by someone, something, because she, in retrospect, seems different since Jonathan died. He then curls up in bed and cries and laments how he'd like to haunt Jonathan and subject him to his thoughts, his musings, his most misguided fantasies. Okay, dude. Instead of dreaming about Jonathan, though, he says, quote, Instead, I'll dream about random photographs of antique furniture, and I'll dream about large statues of Jesus Christ made from old driftwood. Those things are safe, cannot harm me. At least, for now. ... Jesus Christ is right. Enough with the ellipses, dude. Ugh. Anyway, now we get into more lamenting about how undesirable Simeon is to other men, as if they know he's grieving and he's visibly tainted. He also remarks on his neglecting the gym, no longer having the firm and carefully constructed effigy of masculinity he so desperately tried to maintain day after day, year after year. Respectfully, this is the second Eric LaRocca book that has conflated lean muscularity with masculinity, and I simply think that this is anti-bear propaganda. And bears did not die for our sins on Ozempic for you bitches to be body shaming and making it worse. Get that shit out of here, thank you. Anyway, Simeon is now thinking about how him and Jonathan's last time having sex was different before he died, and really, all you need to know is that it's all pretty self-deprecating. So, Simeon reaches out to this Kent guy and they agree to meet at Tremblay's, the electronics store, to get a camera. If you recall in our first video, the blurb on the cover of At Dark I Become Loathsome is from Paul Tremblay, who wrote Cabin at the End of the World, which I also supremely disliked, and will probably do a video on in the future. LaRocca really loves to throw these Easter eggs in, and I personally don't get it. On a technical level, as someone who pays attention to names in the sphere, it took me out of what little action there was. Then Simeon gets a call from Evelyn, but he sends it to voicemail. So, Kent and Simeon meet up. Kent also has a dead husband and talks similar to Simeon, who talks like LaRocca because LaRocca does not know how to write distinct people. Kent says that ghosts look kinda reflective, like glittery specks of tinfoil or like a mirror. Ghosts are kinds of mirrors. They reflect everything closest to them. Sometimes you don't even have to die to become a ghost. They're made softly, quietly, over a period of time, or something. When Simeon asks Kent where he's seen ghosts, he says, "I shouldn't bore you with those details now, ... And Kent looks around like, quote, he was being graded by some invisible advisor. Over and over, LaRocca beats it over our heads that this guy is meant to be suspicious. He's looking around for eavesdroppers. He's looking around for witnesses. Blah, blah, blah. Obviously, Kent is bad news. His name is Kent. Be for real. Anyway, they part ways. Simeon goes on a walk and he manages to take a photo where he thinks he sees Jonathan's face in the vines along a trellis at a park outdoors. Now, Chapter 7. Yay! Whatever. Simeon has plugged in his camera to his computer to transfer his photos. We haven't talked too much about sentence structure because I harped on it a lot in our first Eric LaRocca video, but we are still frequently getting these pretentious rules of threes sentences like, quote, "I would consider myself foolish if I thought I could be afraid to observe something so gentle, so discernibly tender and kind," like every 5 seconds. During this time, Evelyn shows up and she wants to speak to him alone. She's trying to be supportive, offers to give him money if he needs it, and he shows Evelyn his photo that he took and she really doesn't get it. His response in return is so overdone. He says, quote, "I bite my lower lip until I can taste blood. I feel so foolish, so astonishingly stupid for believing I captured Jonathan's essence in a mere photograph. Of course, such things are nonsense. There's no possible chance that Jonathan will ever make himself known to me. I've kept a shrine for him in my mind, delivering thoughts to feed him each and every day. But such offerings are useless. I know this now. Perhaps I'm the one who's haunting him." Girl, we get it. We get it. The concept of reverse haunting. We don't have to go over this a 50th fucking time. Evelyn all but forces Simeon to take some financial support, and then because he feels guilty, he invites her to stay and watch TV with some wine, which he earlier said no to, mind you. She's pouring more wine for herself, and then she passes the wine to him, but we don't ever actually see him drink any. They're then having the, awkward, slow creep of physical contact, but again, mind you, she's the only one drinking, and he says, real subtle, "Can we fuck?" And they do. I'll spare the details, but something Simeon remarks on is the notion of him passing the poison of his, quote, heartache, his misery, to her when they're done. And then while Evelyn takes a shower, Simeon goes into the kitchen to sob. Evelyn seems to think this is Simeon coming back around toward her and suggests her visiting again with or without Carter. Again, inexplicably, he can't tell us what came over him to take advantage of his ex-wife, or from tearing up the photo he took of the vines, which he'd contemplated destroying earlier in the chapter. Then he's thinking about Kent, and then he makes his way, again, even though it's a terrible idea, to his living room to pull out a journal he wrote in when there was a dip in his work and his relationship with Jonathan. Now, we already know that Simeon sucks, but he really sucks in this chapter. First, there's the shit with Evelyn, but now, in these journal entries, Simeon recounts in the most long-winded ways possible that 1, he cheated on Jonathan, which he throws in along with paragraphs like, "Are queer men capable of engaging in monogamous relationships? I don't believe so. I think, on some level, most men are programmed to couple with any viable source of pleasure. Most of the men I've dated have cheated on me, or worse, abandoned me when I was developing a strong connection with them." We will get into this in the analysis, but cheating is not the same as polyamory, you dumb fuck. Then, in the next entry, he recounts contemplating and nearly following through with taking his, quote, precious Carter to the zoo and feeding him to the alligators. He says things like, quote, "Of course, it's one thing to think of drowning your child in the bathtub, holding his head under the foamy water until his little arms stop thrashing against you. But it's another to invent horrible excuses to justify why you need to kill him. I can't bear to admit it, but there's actually a quiet part of me that thinks I'm correct in my idea of murdering Carter. I wonder if it's because of how I've been feeling lately, especially about my new identity as a gay man. After all, the queer community does tend to eat one another. But often the argument exists solely for queer people. I would go so far as to argue that the entirety of the world is a cannibal." What? I'm sorry, but I really do not get this one. But it gets worse. He doesn't just contemplate it, he actually takes Carter to the zoo. And it isn't until he's done lifting Carter and bringing him toward the handrail that he thinks better of murdering his child. Dude. So then Simeon calls Kent again. Once again, he is lamenting how no one pays attention to him, how he's, quote, wondered for so long why others won't pay him any attention when he goes out to the bars and the clubs on the weekends, his soul aching for companionship, his loins yearning for touch, with other statements such as, "Where's the pleasure, the excitement in fucking someone who's already been ravaged? What could another person possibly find enjoyable about mating with me?" Mating, dude. Okay, man. Okay, moving on. Simeon shows Kent the photo he took, and Simeon says that his reaction is dull and insincere, though we're given no reason why. Nonetheless, Simeon gets invited to coffee afterward. The final chapter of part 2 is at the church for another meeting with the Wretches. This is also where Simeon refers to himself as loathsome, which made me shout at a wall. I'm a little traumatized, alright? Kent is just tickled that Simeon is going to present. The problem is no one's really impressed. It's really anticlimactic. When he sits back down next to Kent, he says, quote, while he, Void, speaks to the small crowd, "I unfold the picture and gaze at the image one final time. Then I crumple the paper and push it inside my coat pocket. I could excuse myself now, could pretend I have a stomach cramp and simply leave for the bathroom. But I don't. Instead, I remain seated next to Kent, enduring the agony of the next 2 hours of presentations, constantly being reminded of my suffering, my despair, my sorrow. Man, put down the fucking thesaurus, you're scaring the hoes." This is now the most egregious bit of side questing in the book. Boyd now tells us that one of the members wrote a short play called Predator and Prey, a play in one act, as a way to come to terms with the death of his partner, and Boyd is looking for volunteers to play the roles and read it out. Naturally, Kent offers to play Predator and suggests it might get Simeon some brownie points if he also participates, so he plays Prey. Real subtle. They're standing beneath the statue of Jesus who, quote, appears to be accepting of our little performance like some celestial audience member, some ancient deity keen to be entertained by the pageantry of such pathetic mortals. Okay, dude. So this play. It's 22 pages. I'm gonna be so real with you, anytime I read it, my eyes kind of glaze over, and a lot of it is very tongue-in-cheek allusions to the bigger factors at play, but because everything is frankly very poorly put together, it doesn't read as clever as it's trying to be. Prey speaks with hyphens every 5 seconds stuttering, and Predator asks lots of questions. So Predator's like, was it him? And Prey's like, how could you? And they go back and forth, and it seems like Prey had offered to kill someone with Predator and wasn't all that helpful. The person is still alive though, and Predator delivers the final killing blow. This victim is apparently a homeless ex-cult leader trading handjobs for heroin. There's a lot of discussion of things we have no frame of reference for, like whoever died deserved it because he did things to Prey, and every time Predator wants Prey to redirect, Predator tells him and repeats to him that he needs to ignore it in like a kind of like hypnosis situation. Prey says that this mysterious victim wanted them all, we don't know who this collective entails, to transcend and then return from death. And the word death makes Prey nauseous, and so he'll constantly say, that word. Somewhere on this little journey, Prey opens his bathroom door to show Predator a creature, it's a fucking beetle, that excitedly clicks its pincers, and the room is covered in blood and other bodily fluids. Prey says, he's very tired. His name's Is, like IZ. You see, he is, because I am not. Okay. Predator asks what it is, and Prey says, there's one inside you too. It's when you ignore it that it comes out. The language patterns kind of swap between Predator and Prey here when the bug guy shows up. Prey says that the bug, quote, helps him to say it, Death. He says, I change when I'm near him. Myself does, that is. Your body and yourself are two completely different things. There's an illiteracy of self. It's life's travesty that you can live in your body but never truly know it. ... Your body is the house, you see, your organs, the tiny rooms inside, but yourself is the certainty of that house, and the recognition of what it truly is, decaying organic matter. And yourself adjusts depending on how you identify that. The overwhelming implication is that the bug is also Prey, and that he has to feed the bug and take care of it because they're tethered in some way. I'm kind of thinking like soul gems in the Elder Scrolls, or something else along that line. Predator is freaked out though naturally, and smashes the bug with his hammer. Then Prey literally says that the bug is his anxiety, and he goes to tend to the bug, which has apparently survived, and Predator keeps trying to do the thing where he repeats ignore it, like a hypnosis thing. The play gets a lukewarm response that Simeon is disappointed by, since he and Kent bore so much of themselves. But also, yeah, what the hell was that? It was such an easy way for LaRocca to shoehorn in a no-context scene with lethal white room syndrome that he can just say his plan. It deserved that lukewarm reception, if you ask me. Anyway, Kent and Simeon debrief afterward and confirm that the Wretches don't like Simeon very much, which sucks for Simeon because all he wants is to bring back his beloved Jonathan. Kent says that the Wretches wouldn't be helpful for that anyway, and instead offers to refer Simeon to Porcelain Khaw. He tells Simeon that he's no longer who he was before he met Porcelain, and that Porcelain transformed him and took all his sorrow. Kent tells him to tell Porcelain that he sent Simeon, and that he's eager to follow all instructions, no matter how bizarre. At the end of the chapter, the narration repeats Kent's words twice in italics as Simeon drives off, with Kent's voice filling the empty corners of his mind. if you didn't quite get that this is significant. Part 3, give it up for Part 3. Our epigraph is from 2009 film Antichrist. Quote, "Nothing hurts more than to see the one that you love subjected to mistakes and wrongs." Simeon once again is brooding edgily, this time about sadism and how it can feel good to hurt another living thing sometimes. Pleasurable. Godlike even. Again, with that godlike part. Simeon's looking at this card, wondering to himself, again, hate that phrasing, quote, "Is this another one of those cannibals I keep thinking about? Is this the same monstrous being from the story I read about the boy to be covered in jelly?" And how it would make sense to find himself faced with a connoisseur of human suffering, an expert in the savoring of pitiful flesh. He's sure he'd be only too delighted to strip him of his clothing, to peel the skin from him and feast on the gristle buried there, the wellspring of blood flowing just beneath the surface of flesh. He asks, quote, "Am I nothing more than a hole waiting to be filled, a hollowed container designed for the deposit of someone else's agony, someone else's despair?" This is just like trying to read someone's like kinky erotica, but instead of anything exciting happening, there's just someone crying and trauma dumping to you at the bus stop. Anyway, Simeon sends a melodramatically worded letter to a Clovis R. Morrow, and it's frankly pretty nothing burger, it's just a recap of the situation. The most notable thing is just some prime larocca-isms with phrases like, quote, "Unable to perform basic tasks I once found fulfilling, gratifying," quote, "might be able to help me more efficiently process my grief, my sorrow," and, quote, "incapable of possessing the slightest bit of hope when it comes to my future, my overall outlook," and, quote, "I sincerely hope you will see this letter as an offering, a clear sign that I will submit myself." I was going to say that every time I read a sentence with an ending like that, I think of Emperor Palpatine going, "Use your anger, your hate," but then I went to double check the quote and he doesn't ever even say that. Even a flat villain like Palpatine can have a varied sentence structure, man. This shit's rough. Anyway, Clovis sends a letter. One of the most unrealistic parts of this book is that these letters are not just arriving, but being replied to within 3 days via snail mail, and in the letter is a checklist for the ritual with porcelain. A personal object of the dead with sentimental value, labeled with a return address so that Clovis can, quote, "provide Simeon with an invocation for the ceremony. He will be sent a box containing a specific kind of insect, a silver reflective beetle to be precise." First of all, this is the second time invocation has been used in this book incorrectly. If you break down the etymology, its parts break down essentially to call upon, and for that reason, invocation typically refers to prayers or spells. The silver reflective beetles, which Clovis describes as such multiple times without a name for the species yet are common enough that the instructions for their care are accessible on Google, are not an invocation. I could imagine offering being a more proper term, but I'm frankly not sure that's what larocca was thinking. Clovis warns Simeon that once the object of personal value is sent, the ritual is unavoidable, and spends far too long in true larocca fashion over-explaining and overwriting the fine print on this letter. Whatever. Next, we return to yet another chat log between Simeon and Babyface XOXO, which, when it's revealed who is on the other side of this chat, Simeon says, "Oh shit, ... it's you, ... They yap about how Simeon went to the Wretches, and Simeon's like, "How did you know I went there?" Which, I don't know why he would think that someone inviting him to the Wretches wouldn't be part of it, but he's still shocked by the news regardless. Babyface still decides to conceal their identity, though. Despite this, Babyface says that they know that the Wretches didn't care much for Simeon, but that Kent seemed to like him, and that Kent said something to him after the last meeting and he wanted to know what it was about. Yet we have no indication that Babyface XOXO was ever visible or a suspected witness to any of this. It gets revealed, whoa, that Babyface knows of, but doesn't know, Porcelain Khaw, and Babyface says he's mentioned on forums and blog posts that are hard to find and some have been taken down already. stuff we already know. There's at least 6 uses of ellipses per page, if not more, and Babyface alludes to Porcelain having hurt people in order to help them, and mentions the boy who was covered in jelly until he was eaten alive by flies and gnats, and that Porcelain is also a consumer of souls. This doesn't go over well for Simeon, who doesn't quite believe it, and Babyface says that someone said Porcelain was a consumer of souls after they met him, and Porcelain, quote, took all her sorrow away from her. She said it felt wonderful at first, but then she began to crumble apart like something had poisoned her, contaminated her, ... Babyface claims that Porcelain emptied out this victim and filled her with something else that destroyed her, ... He possessed her, ... Simeon says he'd let Porcelain empty him out if it meant bringing his husband back, ... And Babyface says you'll never get him back, ... When something leaves you, it's gone forever, ... Simeon, ever the philosopher, says, just like this, ... And he leaves the chat room. Next is an email exchange with Evelyn and Simeon, where Evelyn is calling out Simeon for avoiding her and that he's avoiding his son, and she mentions that she was, quote, so happy, so filled with joy after they had sex that one time, where he took advantage of her, and she sounds mysteriously like she's been possessed by Eric LaRocca, as this paragraph is just all him. Quote, I certainly don't expect you to be perfect, to be exemplary in every way so that your integrity is never questioned, your worth is never devalued. To me, you are godlike. You are worth so much more than a one-night stand, a momentary distraction, a temporary diversion. You're none of those things. The thing that irritates me about this love for the word godlike is that it gets used by characters who don't embody any act of worship. Simeon has no traits that would compel worship in frankly anyone, and Simeon's viewing of Jonathan as godlike is equally bullshit because I think he would find being down on his knees for a man as a risk to his frail masculinity. Thank you very much. Evelyn is a little delusional, but it's not her fault that her skeevy ex-husband manipulated her. She says, quote, when you love someone, you pour yourself into them entirely with the hope that they might refill you one day. Please don't let me go too long without being replenished, which, yikes. Not her fault, though. She got used. Simeon sucks. I want justice for Evelyn, but justice here is her realizing that her ex-husband ain't shit. Simeon sends a reply that is really just a bunch of yap apologizing for nothing he isn't going to immediately do again, but he's making a show of good faith, guys, by being vulnerable and asking Evelyn for more money. I fucking hate this guy. Evelyn sends him the money and asks to see him the next weekend, and he says he'll show. He confirms in the following chapter that no, Simeon didn't need the money for rent or food or whatever, but to pay for his meeting with Porcelain. With the process well underway, Simeon has already received his little box of beetles. He feels like there's some presence with him when he goes to bed, and then when he listens to the radio on the way to Porcelain's house, he thinks he hears his own voice. And this radio broadcast is, like most of our side quests, a whole lot of unnecessary yap. The big thing here is that there's a weird thing about mothers. I'll give you some snippets. Quote, I've been taught to never ask about my mother. The only thing I know about her is that she died while giving birth to me. That's the way all creators should perish. A voice silenced during their final declaration, their ultimate gift to the world. It's very strange to think that I was that gift. The speaker describes his childhood being scolded if he asks about his mother, and that he's forced to eat things that taste like rusted metal and to hold his breath till he's lightheaded, and when he wonders about his mother, says, quote, I suppose in many ways it's preferable for children to never know the people who created them, to recognize someone, to know something as simple as the spelling of their names, to possess them, to claim ownership over them. Therefore, sacred things are not meant to be known. A creator's name must never be revealed to its invention. And, quote, I don't wish to know my mother's name. It would be an insult to her generosity, her benevolence as the vessel that brought me into this world. Yes, I suppose all creators could be considered vessels. They carry the weight of the possibility of new existence, soft, tender, and pink. A woman's womb is a precious kind of container, the place where all life begins, where tissue blooms open, and where a new life form's blood begins to flow freely like a secret mountain spring. Brother. Quote, the attendants with masks who come to my cell often remind me that I possess the same gift, the same ability to carry life. But part of me cannot believe them. Even though I've been instructed to accept everything they tell me, there's an inquisitive, stubbornly willful part of me that cannot accept such a fantasy. Am I capable of becoming a creator? Yap. We're given no indication that this speaker is referring to them being a woman or owner of a uterus, with some implications that this is more of a cosmic thing. And, quote, how can a god, yes, even an earthbound god like a creator, recognize its own name? I'm not supposed to know such things. It feels cruel to think that they might have deliberately told me my name so that I wouldn't become something more meaningful when I'm alive. After all, each living thing wants more eventually. Today, perhaps an extra loaf of bread. Tomorrow, the key to open the cell's only door. The only way out. ... I'm going to assume that this is Porcelain speaking in Simeon's voice over the radio, but also this literally never comes up again. One of our beetle friends crawls on Simeon's hand and freaks him out, yada yada yada. Simeon says he half expected Kent to be in the driveway, and that there's a part of him that remains, quote, beguiled by Kent, entranced by his charm and his ability to take command of the room no matter the setting, none of which are traits that have ever been demonstrated to us. And after a little bit more yap, we get to the house, which Simeon notes is part of a well-groomed, wealthy-looking neighborhood, and that it's obvious someone like him would not be welcome. Quote, my indiscretions, my penchants, my interests, all would probably insult the honorable families who reside here, perhaps shock them even. Okay, dude. We get to the house and guess what? More yap. A page passes and he hasn't even taken the keys out of the ignition. But on his way inside there are gargoyles holding mirrors, so you know it's serious business. Low-key, I kind of want gargoyles. I don't know where to buy them though. Simeon is greeted by a, quote, gaunt-faced gentleman whose features are hard to make out because he keeps standing just outside of the light, and his voice is described as being watery and muffled, like talking through damp parchment, which is interesting. I'll give Larocca credit for that. This is Clovis. The walls are bare like they were in the prologue, and like the prologue, Simeon gives up his phone and follows Clovis around like a smitten schoolboy to the threshold where Porcelain awaits. Of course, I'm not surprised, Simeon tells us after Clovis says that the rest has to be done on Simeon's own, just like our prologue. Quote, I expected this. It isn't like Porcelain and I would need a chaperone during our secret rendezvous. Beetles are all over the floor, which are described as being like tossed gemstones, which, again, I'll give credit, I actually liked that description. What I don't like is, quote, I hesitate, worried I'll inadvertently squish some of them while I make my way toward the door at the end of the hall. Tiptoeing with cat-like precision, I continue to make my way down the narrow passage. I'm so fucking tired of making ways. I'm so tired of making my way. Free me. Anyway, the bedroom. Porcelain, a man of medium build and dark complexion, is tied to a grate. Quote, he resembles a man of perfect health, of an admirable physique, rippling abdominals, firm and finely sculpted pectorals, broad shoulders complementing a nearly perfect tapered waist. But despite his obvious bodily perfection, there's something wretched, something utterly loathsome about this poor man. I'm going to kill myself in Minecraft. Also, I don't know how to phrase it, but I'm not a fan of the way that Larocca describes men in his books that are supposed to be conventionally attractive. Like, sure, dude's jacked with a snatched waist. And anyway, Simeon suspects that Porcelain is tied to this grate as a staging for Simeon's enjoyment. 4 times in 2 pages, Porcelain is called either a poor man, a wretched man, a worthless man, etc. And now Simeon has decided, as Porcelain's getting his shit together, that, quote, despite the fact he possesses certain bodily perfections I admire, I can't help but be disappointed by his looks. In fact, he looks so forgettable, So easy to be misremembered and then eventually abandoned to more pressing, more worthwhile thoughts. Even more curious, he slightly resembles the dreadful host from my dream. Brother. Anyway, the whole great thing was Porcelain channeling a memory from a nondescript significant time between Simeon and Jonathan, and at one point, Simeon sees a mirror above the bed that reflects Simeon but not Porcelain, and he says, quote, "It's like he's invisible to all reflective surfaces. A wraith, some unkind phantom." No shit, dude. So here's the part that is unsurprising, since this is a larocca book, but was not outright stated at any point beforehand. These visits are a sex thing, 1000%. And in the next scenes, when Porcelain is fully channeling Jonathan, he and Simeon are boinking in the astral plane with Porcelain's body as the conduit. This is littered with literal asides of insecurity, like Simeon saying that he is no specimen of masculinity when he undresses in front of Porcelain. Simeon sees astral plane Jonathan, asks if it's him, and then they immediately spend what, quote, feels like hours of making love and taking turns fucking and sucking each other. They finally kinda talk, but it's stilted. Larocca's trying to sound mystical. There's this dialogue that ends with Jonathan saying that Simeon should be grateful for his memories, since they're often very different from what actually happened. And then it's time to go, and Jonathan just keeps telling Simeon to ignore it until the vision ends, and Porcelain is looking at Simeon like he's done something real fucked up. One, this is basically the only through line between what's actually happening and that one act play from earlier, and we don't get a clear answer on what Simeon's done that's freaked out Porcelain. But here we are. Simeon says he forgot what tenderness between two men in love felt like, in response to the astral boinking and Porcelain holding Simeon while he cries afterward. Later, as Simeon's leaving, he describes being afraid to squish any of the, quote, small beetles littering the cramped passageway and guarding Porcelain's lair the way scarabs might guard Pharaoh's ancient tomb. Clovis is annoyed because Simeon took longer than his share of time, and now Simeon's full cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs about Porcelain. He calls the house, quote, this consecrated, hallowed home, this den of absolution, of unending grace and sympathy, and in the same breath, as he asks Clovis about Porcelain's powers, refers to it as dark magic invoked for the sake of the grieving. Clovis's answer to if Porcelain's always been able to do astral conjugal visits is, quote, not always, and when Clovis first met him, he was sucking cock for a living and then reveals he's the strawberry jelly boy. More on that in the analysis. Clovis says that he loves Porcelain with his entire being, okay? Which leads to Simeon making a bunch of sweeping statements about Clovis being or not being a puppet. Kent calls as Simeon leaves, and it's about what we'd expect. Simeon glazes Porcelain for the entire call and expresses a desire to seek Porcelain's services again, even if it destroys him.
Guys, do you think he's going to get destroyed?
Oh no. Chapter 11 opens with, quote, when you're gay, the whole world wants to annihilate you. In fact, it takes pleasure in doing so. Okay, white man. On top of describing homophobia, he says, quote, even our own bodies betray us, unable to accommodate our perversions, how they eventually fruit with disease, how they rupture as if it were adequate punishment for our transgressions against the natural order of things. My note here says, okay cis, word for gay, condoms exist, but go off, I guess. He's always felt as though he's existed, quote, as a nuisance, something to be squished or snuffed out because of his perversions, his carnal crimes against nature. All of which leads up to Simeon recanting a memory of Jonathan bringing home a third that Simeon waffles on his enthusiasm about and watches from the literal cut chair. During this, Jonathan says ignore it, but no context still about what that actually means. Now we get into another manifesto from Simeon Link, quote, monogamy doesn't exist. It's a deception invented by men and women that gay people are incapable of properly imitating. This is a thought that comes to me time and time again, especially when I'm asked to visit Carter at the park with Evelyn. More yap about Carter, he's watching him skate at the skate park, and he's filled with the horrible thought, quote, committed, untainted love between two people cannot and never will truly exist. It's impossible to love solely one person, to claim them as yours, to belong to them in a way that makes you content to not seek out others for similar companionship. Yap about Evelyn on her phone, and then quote, perhaps it's easier for men and women to commit themselves fully to each other. It's different when you're queer, especially for gay men. A blowjob is more like a handshake as opposed to some sacred sexual act between committed partners. We're gonna go over this part in our analysis, so I'll just let that sit with you for now. While observing Carter at the skate park, again, we never see him speak except later in this scene to say, "What is it, Dad?" Simeon notices that the eyes look shiny and mirror-like, quote, like identical silver orbs, the very same glittering pieces of metal I saw in that awful wooden figure of Christ in the recreation hall. Thank you, I almost had to think for myself for a sec to get to that conclusion. This plot section is so long because there is so much shit to poke at, but I promise we are close to the finish line. Simeon wants another astral conjugal visit, and Kent thinks this is a bad idea, or at least a questionable one, and says it's a pity that the ritual didn't work the first time. From what I understand, it working is taking away all of the client's sorrow, and I don't think astral boinking is the way to do that, but what do I know? Now, Simeon is beginning to think that his favorite stripper at the club is secretly in love with him, or something to that effect. Quote, perhaps we achieved something that very few clients experience while in his presence, wonders our doomed idiot. Quote, was I enraptured with the memory of Jonathan? Or rather, was I excited to make love to something as alluring, as intoxicating as Porcelain Khaw, he wonders. Simeon calls Clovis, and rightfully, Clovis is annoyed, but Simeon is promising to pay extra, even though he apparently needed money from Evelyn to pay for it the first time, and Clovis is saying that the ritual may not work at all a second time. After some yap about Jonathan being better at art than Simeon, we smash cut to post-sex Porcelain as Jonathan with Simeon, who is musing on sex and how Simeon doesn't often feel like a man, but that there's something about Jonathan that makes him feel feral and awakens, quote, some kind of longing, yearning deep inside him, the kind of lust that defines a true man. Again, analysis. Just let it wash over you. Jonathan, during this second meeting, asks Simeon why he keeps coming back, and when Simeon says it's because he loves him, Jonathan shakes his head and points out that Simeon comes to these meetings with everything rehearsed. Jonathan claims that Simeon misremembers him, and that he never, ever spoke like this, or that he remembers things that he has no memory of. And, dun dun dun, Jonathan asks Simeon if he's ever heard of a reverse haunting. Even though Simeon has literally thought of the concept before in the narration, he claims he hasn't heard of the concept. And Jonathan says, quote, there are no such things as ghosts, Simeon, ... You're the one keeping me alive. You're the one haunting me, ... And then Jonathan says ignore it over and over again, and the vision is over. Porcelain has a nosebleed. Simeon asks to go again, and Porcelain says no and goes right to sleep. Simeon naturally is questioning if anything he remembers about his husband is real. Fuck, I think to myself while my stomach spirals itself into impossible little knots, says our protagonist, and I always find it really funny when authors put interjections like that as whole thoughts. I don't have any groundbreaking commentary there, it's just kinda corny. Simeon is taking a shower at home, and he gets a weird tummy ache behind his belly button that appears to get worse and worse the more he tries to not think about it. Finally, after he starts bleeding from his stomach, he reaches into his belly button and pulls out the shard of a mirror. When he looks into it, he sees Jonathan's face staring back, and he realizes it's a memory he forgot of their argument about having a baby. Jonathan says that they should name their prospective child Spot, because it would be a dark stain on them both, something they'd eventually regret, just like Jonathan regrets Simeon. And when Simeon asks why, he says a bunch of nasty things, and then says that Simeon asks him this question all the time, and day after day, when Jonathan answers, Simeon ignores it. The vision ends, and the mirror is just a mirror again. Also, this entire time, the shard is only referred to as mirror-like reflective glass. Dude, it's just a fucking mirror. You're padding your word count for nothing. Anyway, Simeon is not doing well after this and feels like he shouldn't be alone. So, naturally, he takes advantage of his ex-wife again and asks her to come over. She shows up and dotes on him a bit, and then Simeon asks if she thinks that Jonathan ever really loved him. And him asking questions about the man that she thinks stole Simeon away from her after he already started messing with her feelings by taking advantage of her earlier in the book is naturally very upset, and it's clear she thought that Simeon was going to make some sort of confession toward her. This doesn't go well. Simeon in the mix here says that there's basically no possible reality in which he could or would ever love Evelyn, and I have some thoughts on this we might get into in the analysis, but I think that it's plenty possible for someone to love someone and not be attracted to them, not in a split attraction model way, but I don't know, man. I'd hope if you thought enough of someone to marry them that even if you realized that you weren't sexually attracted or romantically attracted to them, that there'd still be love toward them, as your friend. Your partners should be your friends, too. I don't know, man. Anyway, Evelyn runs out, and Simeon, in a brief moment of clarity, says he deserved it. No shit. This drives him right back into the spectral arms of Porcelain Khaw, except not actually, because Clovis says that he's not sure if a third meeting is even possible or worthwhile. And again, like the icky man who thinks that the stripper is in love with him, Simeon writes back saying he's showing up tonight, and he's not taking no for an answer. The final chapter before the epilogue is here, and it's a short spiral downward. Conveniently, Clovis isn't at Porcelain's house. I don't know why. There's some overwritten descriptions about the gargoyles being denizens of another world, purveyors of brutality, eager to judge all trespassers, all who might arrive unannounced. Spooky. Simeon says, quote, "The whole house seems to soften, thawing with warmth the way a giant beast might settle when presented with the sacred offering of nourishment. Am I something to be fed to some invisible deity? Some gibbering monstrosity?
Guys, do we think someone's going to get eaten?"
Simeon's wandering around and finds a washroom that he says feels like, quote, a transient sort of place, a place without an identity, a godless creature without a proper name, I guess. And in this washroom, behind where the door swings open, there's an oil portrait of, quote, both Porcelain and Clovis, their features somewhat exaggerated and embellished to make them more menacing, crueler even. In the portrait, Porcelain is situated on a large chair and his legs are spread open with an obvious invitation. He's dressed entirely in white like some angelic cherub, like some impressive dignitary from a celestial court. Behind him, Clovis leers over his shoulder with the same disapproving scowl of a parent or guardian. I noticed something especially unusual about the way the artist has drawn the eyes in the painting. Their eyes are silvery, reflective almost, and hollow-looking as though they have been carved out and replaced with tiny bits of metal. At the bottom of the portrait, there's some graffiti scrawled there. I squint, drawing closer, and I read what's been written in the corner. Fucking cannibals. Every single time, Larocca picks the exact same adjectives to describe things, and I really wonder if he thinks that this is a subtle way to cue to the reader that these paintings or images are related, which means he thinks that the reader is stupid, or if he's unaware that he needs a better vocabulary outside of when he's whipping out the thesaurus for the rule of threes. Anyway, Simeon notices that there's a bunch of photographs behind this painting, and they all seem to be from members of the Wretches, and even a photo from Simeon's old boss. The faces are all gone though, like the ghostly faces or whatever. Simeon runs to the room that Porcelain's expected to be in and contemplates being polite, but then asks himself if Porcelain is really worth decency or formality. Mind you, this is a humble, supernatural small business owner, thank you. Simeon compares Porcelain to a sex worker, more on that in the analysis, and barges in. Simeon has a hairpin from Jonathan and asks for round 3, and Porcelain points out that Clovis said not to come. Porcelain is kind of amused by all of Simeon's chittering, which leads to some more yap about the reverse haunting and that maybe Simeon is actually destroying the memory of his husband by trying to bring him back. Final answer from Porcelain is no. No more astral horizontal polka. And Simeon says, "You could refuse me? After all we've shared together?" Porcelain says, "I shared, you took, ... That's all you do, ... Simeon says, "Weren't you willing to give? Isn't that what you're capable of doing?" And Porcelain says, "Try doing it day after day, because he's very tired and his beetles should unionize." Simeon says, "You're turning me down," and goes to touch him, which turns into a physical struggle that ends with the hairpin skewering through Porcelain's throat, and of course, Simeon's full of regret now. Porcelain says, "Do what you've always done. Ignore it," and says ignore it several times. And when Simeon says that all he wanted to know was if Jonathan ever really loved or cared about him, Porcelain says that Jonathan is inside of him. Literally. Porcelain lifts up his shirt and Simeon notices for apparently the first time that Porcelain's belly button is actually a really dark scab, except it's actually a hole, and it's vaguely sexual, but Simeon gets lured into what is definitely not a belly button and is entirely swallowed up in it. The descriptions here are really abstract. This whole process is vaguely pleasurable for Porcelain, and once Simeon is through, he says, quote, "I have become the wretched, incurable thing that now looks out from beyond Porcelain's eyes. I am the curiosity lingering in the weighted breath of every question forced upon a meek, unassuming visitor who might never return. I am the sadness existing in the wordless questions, the muted condolences, the pitiful touch. I am nothing more than a blemish on Porcelain's very soul. Am I a ghost? Am I something that yearns to be remembered? A thing that aches to be recalled by someone else? No one will ever come for me. That much is certain. I am now very much a permanent relic of Porcelain's assortment of curiosities, a spirit not so dissimilar from the tiny reflective ones that Kent spoke of. Blah blah blah. It's so much edgy yap. What you really need to know is that Simeon got absorbed into Porcelain and is now one of many souls stuck in his little flesh prison, which he refers to as, quote, "this forever undulating sculpture of muscle and sinew," with cohorts that are, quote, "somewhat pleasant despite the awful circumstances." He's able to, despite everyone being disembodied souls, a middle-aged woman in particular that he enjoys talking to, whose name is, wait for it, Genevieve. I don't know, man, that shit felt hokey, but it gets worse. Hold on to your pants, because it is time for the epilogue. Our epigraph is from 1981 film Possession. Quote, "If I lay at your feet and yelped like a dog, would you step over me?" And we open with, quote, "One of the thoughts that upsets me day after day while I exist here is the memory of my sweet, precious Carter." I'm gonna keep this short and sweet because for how little happens, it's awfully wordy, but here's what you need to know. Evelyn has somehow identified Porcelain Khaw and has reached out to Clovis seeking his services. She now says that she wants to haunt her ex-husband, but also that she hardly expected she would also need to be on her toes about her son, who she says has had dealings with unsavory people online. Carter, now hold on to your hats here, Carter, who up until this point all we know about is that he skates and has a deadbeat dad, has orchestrated this entire thing. Carter is babyface XOXO and somehow has been on a bunch of forums talking about performing a mercy killing on his father. Somehow, he has had his eyes on the inside of the Wretches while never being recognized at meetings, and somehow he's been in the same online circles pulling the strings on his father, and everything has gone according to his plans. But to make matters worse, Evelyn says, quote, "I worry that I'm somewhat responsible for my child's actions, for allowing him to sign up for social media accounts at an early age and permitting him to have unrestricted access to the internet while I wasn't supervising." What? She's still processing the hideous truth that her son is not as innocent, not as charming and kind as he pretends to be. Sweet fucking lord. Apparently, Simeon has figured out a way to communicate with Porcelain as a disembodied spirit while he, quote, blazes inside the bulb of Porcelain's eye. But Porcelain says he has no more use for Simeon because there are certain souls he's not able to possess. Or whatever. So Porcelain coughs Simeon up, and now Simeon is one of those little beetles? Welcome back, Franz Kafka, I guess. Evelyn shows up with Simeon's photo of the trellis from earlier, and we get a repeat of the prologue where he says the whole, "There's many ways to do this, but you won't like any of them, because you're going to have to suffer." Womp. Simeon is hoping that Evelyn notices him and acknowledges the loathsome insect he's become. He laments his failing his son, and he hopes that Evelyn turns away, but she doesn't, and she moves closer to Porcelain's bed, quote, "a dark tide dragging her farther and farther away from him until he can see her no more." The end. Holy shit. Long-standing friends of the channel will know that every analysis opens with an examination of the Book of the Day's genre. While some writers may feel like genre labels are restrictive little boxes to confine stories in, genre exists for a reason. They help readers identify what promises they can expect that authors will make, and in turn that trust helps readers identify their preferences and authors to identify their readership. This is a gift and a curse. If you tell your reader to expect something and then you turn around and don't deliver on it, that's a bad look, and it's going to downgrade your credibility. Unfortunately, this is really common, and it's true of Wretch, too. If we look back to the publisher blurb, Wretch is described as a nightmarish, haunting, tech gothic thrill ride. It certainly has common elements of horror and paranormal fiction, but would I describe it as tech gothic? I don't think so. Let's start with unpacking the meaning of tech gothic. When I looked it up to make sure I wasn't insane, I ended up stumbling upon an old favorite anime. I usually don't go for anime, which makes it even more shocking, called Ergo Proxy, alongside some other books. However, my search in general yielded minimal definitive results. The term tech gothic or techno-gothic from a literature standpoint isn't an established genre. Most titles that showed up in my search were labeled as cyberpunk, which we discussed in our last review on Volatile Memory. What you might find are science fiction titles that pull from the gothic, or vice versa, or cyberpunk, or darker sci-fi that tends toward themes we might more commonly find in gothic or dark romantic literature. Not dark romance, dark romantic, to be clear. Some examples: Ergo Proxy is an anime I watched in high school that I really liked, but I haven't watched it in ages, so it might not hold up, so don't come for me. It's cyberpunk, but I think there's some good reasons why it's showing up sometimes in my searches for tech gothic. World's gone to shit, humanity is sequestered to domed cities and live alongside androids peacefully until a virus has spread that gives androids self-awareness, causing them to commit murders. The series opens as a murder investigation of sorts, which calls back to the roots of gothic fiction and detective stories. This all still sounds very cyberpunk, but the application of the virus in particular is almost religious in nature, and there are more monstrous creatures that guard over the domed cities, there's strong social commentary, a protagonist whose appearance is literally based off of Amy Lee of Evanescence, etc., etc. It also incorporates dark romanticism, which focuses on human fallibility, judgment, sin, and the question of if people can truly be good, alongside common gothic tropes such as a Byronic hero, a doppelganger, extreme isolation, fear, the past intruding into the present. I could go on for hours, but Ergo Proxy still also fits all of the tropes of cyberpunk. Honestly, this is probably the best example I can give. Just about everything else I found was either techno horror, which is different. I'm looking at you, I have no mouth and I must scream, or is just more cyberpunk. Much like the punk and goth music genres, while cyberpunk and techno gothic aren't the same, they're cousins and sometimes hold hands. So, let's revisit what elements might be leading the publisher to label Wretch as techno gothic. What's techno about this? Frankly, not a lot. The most technological it gets is the use of cameras and the presence of message boards. However, this story just as easily could have existed without cameras or message boards. This could have been analog letters and in person interactions, and not much would have changed. And the point of Porcelain has nothing to do with the technology his stories appear in. The creepiness of the internet in this novel is entirely mundane. The son, Carter, was manipulating things, I guess, if we want to give him that credit, but was that the focus? No. What cyberpunk and technogothic do that Wretch doesn't is focus on the actual technology as integral to the plot. So looking back to Ergo Proxy, the setting requires technology to be at the forefront as androids are being infected by a virus that's making them sentient and angry about it. That technology is a vehicle for the story's philosophical themes, sure, but they're also front and center in general. Wretch's plot is not driven by the technological elements it contains, it's driven solely by Simeon's grief and lust. He just also happens to be on Reddit. The gothic elements are readily apparent, however, and however poorly, as the story is concerned with the supernatural, the past haunting the present, and the melodrama shared between the gothic and dark romantic eras, though I'd argue that those eras portrayed said melodrama in a far more grounded manner, whereas most of the time I just wanted to roll my eyes at Simeon. I wouldn't say, however, that Wretch is a gothic novel, though, given that there are several important tropes that aren't fulfilled, especially and most importantly, gothic fiction has a huge emphasis on location. Usually an old castle, a mansion, or its ruins, or some other house with important history that could be new or old. Usually the location is almost its own character. You could argue that Porcelain Khaw's house is satisfactory, but I don't think that holds up because the story isn't centered around it until the very end. Wretch also adopts some gothic language too, though I feel that it's mostly stilted and unnatural, like larocca's penchant for describing wonders and enchantments. The same can be said for some choices in description, as larocca's descriptions are often hyperbolic, which is another trait of original Gothic titles, but again, just because it possesses these traits doesn't mean that they've been executed well. But again, tech Gothic, I'm not sold. Given that this isn't even a commonly agreed upon genre, I feel safe in saying that I would have felt more that this was tech Gothic if supernatural elements were directly affecting the technology, or if Porcelain had some control over those things. But these ideas aren't unified, and this is a novel that desperately tries and fails to say something about our society, none of which has anything to do with technology aside from Evelyn regretting Carter's unrestricted internet access, which... same. This is a horror novel. Paranormal thriller if you're feeling spicy. There's some body horror at the end. If you want to go identity marketing, it's queer horror. Nevertheless, it's horror. Its aim was ostensibly to horrify, disgust, or discomfort the reader, and it did those things, however poorly. By calling it tech gothic, whoever greenlit that blurb heavily misled the reader into thinking that there will be far more focus on technology than there ever actually was. Just because there's technology near the spooky thing doesn't mean it's a story about technology being spooky. However, I'm feeling a little generous, and I'm going to give our friend Larocca some credit. This was a better horror novel than At Dark I Become Loathsome, given that At Dark I Become Loathsome wasn't scary, didn't disgust me, and it read more like a coming-of-age novel. There were a number of points in this book where I said, "Aw, hell nah." They were also just ridiculously inconsistent and weightless, so I didn't care as much. The whole weird stomach thing at the end? Hell nah. The jelly thing? Hell nah. Simeon being within 5 feet of another human being. Hell nah. Moving on. I also want to give a shout out to Dumb Luck Lila on Goodreads, who called this book Catcher in the Rye for suicidal gay men. Please read At Dark I Become Loathsome. You'll regret it. I'm going to keep this short and sweet because I'm tired. What in the fresh fucking hell was that plot twist? Here's the thing. If you go back, there's teeny tiny little hints at this big reveal that I can almost assure you were either edited in after the fact or are the result of me giving a very, very generous reading of these events. We already know that these plot points are all highly reminiscent of other larocca titles, right? The neglectful father-son relationship and the demon twink between them is practically canonical. But unlike the last time where the twist was primarily weak because of how heavy-handed and obvious it was, now it's weak because it came from out of nowhere and served no purpose. Hear me out. There's a possible reality where this twist was actually good. Most of the time when we ask the question of if a twist in a story is good, the question is really if the twist was so obvious that no one in the audience could see it coming, or if it caught the audience by surprise. A neat twist can add some intrigue and engagement for audiences. They're born, most often, out of pressing questions that the audience wants an answer to. A romantic drama might be haunted by the question of will they, won't they, or a partner is hiding something from the other and we don't know what it is. A murder mystery might have a clear suspect but no definitive answer until a surprise ending that explains it all and forces the audience to reconsider how they viewed the entire story or how they understood a character. Twists should recontextualize everything, and certainly Simeon's eventual cosplay of Gregory Samsa being the result of his teenage son's machinations is a good example of recontextualizing. But also it sucks, and we're gonna figure out why. Even though I didn't love the twist in At Dark I Become Loathsome, I thought it sucked because it didn't even really feel like a twist. At no point did the revelation that Jinx was the murderer of Ashley's son feel like it came out of left field. Instead, the reason it sucked was that there wasn't even an attempt to make the reader think otherwise. And because this book spent so much time in side quest stories, there was no room to distract the reader from the looming question of who did it. A mystery was presented to us that did not become part of the narrative. We sat for 80% of the novel knowing there was a mystery while, instead of trying to solve it, we watched Ashley Luton be sad and lonely on message boards and doing mock burials. Without that part of the plot being utilized, we got the end result of a twist with none of the tension to give it good payoff. And here, it's 10 times worse. Porcelain Khaw is a figure that got shrouded, somewhat, in mystery. At first, he's some cosmic entity that offers Faustian deals for boy servants that sound like he should be on a registry. At other points, he's just a sex worker who can channel the dead, and other times he's a demon that consumes souls by swallowing victims whole through his belly button, and then turns the ones he mysteriously can't keep in his body into beetles. But also he was broke, turning tricks and living on instant cup noodles when he purchased a child servant. 99.9% of the mystery in Wretch is to do with this individual's existence. And what mystery remains is to do with Jonathan or Simeon's memory of Jonathan. Most of what we don't know about Jonathan, we don't find out either, but I think this part is intentional and I can respect it. There's plenty that we don't know in Wretch that isn't mystery. We don't know much at all about Evelyn or Carter. We know nothing of their internal worlds or what they do outside of hang on to the possibility Simeon will give a damn. Carter has one line of dialogue. Not even kidding, it is just one singular line. We also aren't ever given a reason to desire more information on Carter or Evelyn. Simeon is concerned with, and therefore the audience is concerned with, Porcelain and this quest of Simeon's for relief from his unending, unyielding, unstoppable sorrow. See what I did there? What? A twist has to answer a big, pressing question. and in the process, scribble over existing supported answers and then generate some new questions in the light of our recalibrated intel. Generally, a big twist is going to have some important implications for a story's overarching themes, too. Some good examples of this include The Sixth Sense, where the psychologist seeing the child who sees dead people actually is dead people, or Fight Club, where you realize Tyler Durden and the narrator are actually the same dude, and we're coming back around now. But the identity of the true mother of the coven run through the Marcos Dance Company in Suspiria 2018. These big reveals add a whole new dimension of meaning to the earlier plot points while generating a sharp emotional response in the moment for readers or viewers. Carter being the mind behind Simeon's demise is one of the most irritatingly pointless reveals I've seen in a hot minute. But more importantly, it undermines a bit of potential commentary that could have survived this ultimately really muddy book. But to make matters worse, it also just makes no fucking sense. I went over it a little bit ago, so I won't rehash it too much, but you cannot tell me that a 16-year-old boy was able to orchestrate his father encountering a soul-devouring demon twink who offers conjugal visits in the astral plane with the intention of killing him. Logistically, it's impossible. You could argue that Carter was under the influence of Porcelain because of that one scene where Carter's eyes are silver, but to what end? Even if there was a logical way Carter could have pulled it off, this reveal has little to no payoff because we don't really know Carter enough to feel betrayed by him, and on the flip side, Carter was treated like shit enough by Simeon that I don't feel too bad that this happened. To make matters worse though, part of the satisfaction, what little there is, of Simeon's final destination is that Simeon dug his own grave by being a piece of shit. Someone else pulling the strings undercuts that entirely. When books like Wretch get criticized for having nothing to say, this is just one example of how and why. Carter exists only as a prop to point to for Simeon's extant social obligations, so much so that if he weren't part of the book, the plot would still stand on its own 2 feet. Evelyn could have sought Simeon out without a child being part of the picture, and Jonathan could have not wanted children for a number of reasons, and then nothing else would change. I don't see any point in this plot twist, and its pointlessness only draws attention to the other plot holes in the book and what things were underutilized. The Wretches are part of the story only kind of. It's implied that either the Wretches are integral to feeding Porcelain victims or that they are the victims and Porcelain's been collecting them like Pokemon, but Simeon's social capital in the group doesn't even matter. He participates in 2 meetings and then Kent is like, damn, that sucks. They wouldn't have been able to help you anyway, but here's this demon guy's number. Most of the reason we don't know much in the story has less to do with ideas being concealed so much as how often ideas are contradicted. Readers have to have a baseline to make sense of before you start stirring up the primordial soup. Carter being involved with quote-unquote unsavory characters online that led to Simeon and Porcelain being involved not only tried to upend a level of sense that didn't exist, but also it was low-key really funny that right at the end Evelyn's talking about her son needing parental controls on his computer when her husband is a beetle because he assaulted a demon twink for refusing him service. With Carter's lack of presence in the story also, it becomes incredibly obvious that this plot choice was an afterthought. And when the plot point that recontextualizes your whole story feels like an afterthought, that makes your whole book feel like an afterthought, and this is just another indicator of what kinds of issues are occurring because of glaring issues in editing. I'm running out of mental battery for talking about this book right now, and this is the last segment I'm writing and recording, so I'm going to cut it off here, though this likely won't be the last chapter in order in the analysis section. Long story short, if you're going to write a twist, you really need to thread the needle with how you navigate information. Twists are about tension, not about throwing off the reader, though that often is what it looks like. Every writer has their quirks and preferences. For myself, I tend to write characters with a lot of trauma or mental illness, rich spiritual lives, are generally queer, often disabled, or have some sort of fraught relationship with their body not serving them the way that they want them to, and are either entirely emotionally constipated or the exact opposite. Generally. It never starts out that way, and I never intend for it to be that way, but the stories and themes I like to explore generally create characters that have these traits. For example, my work in progress. My two main characters are either current or former priests, fantasy religious setting, though one of them is really coded to be like a witch of sorts. They're both disabled, they're both queer, they both have various forms of PTSD. One has a tendency to push down or intellectualize all of his emotions, the other one tends to experience his emotions without understanding them and often fearing them. Having a type in this manner isn't necessarily a bad thing, and even though this little grocery list seems hyper specific when you look at it this way, the traits of these characters become far more unique when held up against the setting, the plot, their wants, and the situations those wants get them into. That's writing. This is why stock character tropes exist. They work because the story you write will make the stockness of it all at least a little bit less apparent. And it can even be an effective vehicle for certain ideas and like cultural critiques. My ambrose-isms and larocca's larocca-isms in a vacuum aren't necessarily a bad thing. If I hadn't read At Dark I Become Loathsome, I wouldn't have been able to identify them as larocca-isms, for example, but now that we inherently can't just view this book in a vacuum, it's impossible not to try to look at the whole picture. That said, I know damn well there are people that have identified more isms based on other things that Larocca has written, but I have the feeling I'll be revisiting Larocca in the future the next time I hit a reading slump and need to get angry, so I want to keep this to what I've actually read. Part of what took me out of this book so quickly was how similar Simeon Link was to Ashley Luton. Two books in a row, LaRocca has portrayed wet blanket, edgy, suicidal, self-hating queer men who hate their bodies for not being jacked, idealize potential or past male partners as the ideal male physique, claim to not feel entirely like a man not because of gender reasons, but for not fulfilling highly specific expectations of masculinity that most cis men never fulfill. Both lost their partners to cancer. Both listen more to the head between their legs than the one on their shoulders and get into trouble on Reddit. Both are neglectful fathers. Both are selfish and manipulative to the people around them, but insist upon feeling guilty for it. Feel that they are followed by some sort of dark aura that makes them repulsive and undesirable. Have no hobbies, no job prospects, no friends, have had a wife at some point, but the wife is archetypal at best and has no personality outside of the main character's relationship to them, gets manipulated by a secretly, or maybe not so secretly evil twink that either steals souls or kills children, and also they both, in general, just kinda suck. There's more, but I'm probably forgetting. Then there's the plot similarities. Both claim to be about grief, but really seem to be more about what happens when you let selfish, unempathetic queer men let their internalized homophobia overtake their sense of reason and follow their dicks where most wouldn't go with a gun. There's more plot in this book than At Dark I Become Loathsome, thank God. Our main character actually wants something specific, and it isn't just the book happening to him, which is a pretty big improvement. That said, both books include chance encounters with people online who incite a downward spiral in the main character, all this being on supposed local chat rooms, offering solutions but secretly or not so secretly being the person orchestrating everything. There's also loose representations of men and boys being sexually assaulted, but either being used as shock value or with notions of consent being really dubious at best. Clovis's abuse and Porcelain's assault by Simeon being the examples here, and Jinx's abuse of Bailey and the dubious consent in the characters portrayed in the side quest short stories as are examples in At Dark I Become Loathsome. The side quests are another factor. Thankfully, they're not as egregious in Wretch, but at Dark I Become Loathsome, there are three major side quests that are essentially just short stories inserted into the book to pad things out. And in an interview, Larocca just straight up admits that they thought that the stories would never get published on their own for being too extreme, and inserted them into the book to salvage them. Frankly, they're still more extreme than anything his core book plots have shown, and I thought that they were more interesting. This side questing thing really is one of larocca's most lethal habits. Not only is it just not effective storytelling in the way that it's done here, as the side quests rarely have complete relevance to the plot, but when they are relevant, it's because the same points get rehashed later, making the side quest pointless altogether. It shows me that larocca is either not confident in their storytelling abilities and overcompensating for it, or that they are confident in their abilities, but delusional. To make matters worse, both books, and I've gotten the sense this is just larocca's game, are impossibly edgy and overwritten. It's hard sometimes to always pinpoint it, but you can smell from a mile away when an author thinks that their work is the most profound shit imaginable. We've gone over the majority of the gems in this book, but larocca's dark and twisted mind, as it were, is less dark and twisted in the I'm scared that you came up with this way, and instead writing suffering with the same overly self-indulgent melodrama you'd find in a middle schooler's journal. Except I knew people in middle school who frankly wrote it better. I'll spare you rehashing it all. Alongside these little quirks, larocca also has a penchant for writing barely any dialogue whatsoever, and when he does, the dialogue is stilted, unnatural, and reads as just as pretentious as his general prose. Not everyone has to write a lot of dialogue, to be clear, but when the dialogue that does exist is so flimsy and characters like Kent are described as being charismatic and charming without either trait being displayed at all, that's a pretty substantial red flag to me. But the cherry on top of all of this, if you ask me, is that larocca's books have been identified by some people as quote-unquote grief horror, and many of his books claim to be about grief in general as a concept, much like how I would argue that a story with a lot of sex in it doesn't necessarily make it erotic. I'd equally argue that just because a book has grief or a grieving character in it doesn't mean that the book is about grief. Here's the thing. Grief, like love, are extremely personal emotions, which means that unless you have a really good understanding of the characters experiencing them, it's going to be really obvious how flimsy and abstract everything is. At least on some level, when it comes to flat idealistic depictions of love, there's genre convention to tell us how and when to suspend our disbelief. Look at every fairy tale about true love ever. The story isn't in and of itself about love, but what love means in the context of the world. So, we have two larocca originals about grief right now. Grief is messy. People cope in different ways. People do whack shit. Nothing I'm saying here is contradicted by these books, so you may be wondering why I'm bringing it up at all. But grief generally requires love of some form, and if it doesn't, there's a whole other slew of complex emotions that should come about as a result of whoever or whatever's absence spurs the emotion. The protagonists in both books insist upon a deep grief toward their beloved so-and-sos, but we experience this grief through their depraved at worst and pitiable at best meltdowns. We don't see who the people they grieve really are or why they mattered, or why we should care that they're gone. I'm not saying that we need necessarily a crash course on everything about Jonathan or whatever, but more that if we're going to say that this book is about grief or the idea that not letting go of someone's memory can actually haunt their spirit, I have to be able to believe that this is about the person who's gone and not just the idea of them. That's where the flimsiness of larocca's characters come into play, because I don't necessarily think that it's just the dead that are flimsy. The living characters are equally as underdeveloped, so when you introduce complex interpersonal emotions like grief over a loved one, you have to have characters that can handle those concepts maturely, and that's just not possible with characters like Simeon. So instead, we get melodramatic internal monologues that feel like nothing because they are nothing. Jonathan is just a concept for all parties involved. Larocca isn't bad at writing grief because he doesn't get grief as a concept, but because he doesn't get character. But this issue existed in At Dark I Become Loathsome, so why are we here? Again, I'm feeling generous, and I want to give larocca the benefit of the doubt and say that this was more interesting and, for lack of a better word, better than its predecessor. But that doesn't mean stop there. I hope that larocca slows down and learns to let his ideas mature, because another larocca-ism, in my opinion, is that so far the ideas they've come up with are interesting. They're just being written by someone who doesn't have the chops yet and has a fan for an editor, which means he likely has a circle of people who are glazing each new thing that comes out without pushing or challenging him. And that is extremely dangerous for your well-being as a writer. I was watching a video a few months ago from an author telling people to stop trying to give workshop notes on consumer reviews and that there's no such thing as constructive criticism for finished products because it's already been constructed. I think that's a weak take and also a misunderstanding of what that word means. I'm not going to put the author on blast. I'm certain if you dig hard enough, you'll find it. So let's just look at the definition of constructive criticism. I really don't feel like making this into an academic paper on feedback, so honestly, this is all coming from off the dome, but I've done a lot of workshopping, so I at least think I know what I'm talking about. Constructive criticism or constructive feedback, some people call it feedback or critique for a number of reasons. Most of them, in my opinion, feel very much like we're just diving headfirst into semantics, is when you give feedback to someone with the intention of it being used to improve something or build it up, hence constructive, rather than simply saying if something is good or bad. Some people will say that the notion of constructive feedback itself is problematic because it implies that everyone will react to your feedback as if it is helpful, which in my opinion says more about the recipient of the feedback than the person giving it. Why? There are very clear hallmarks of what makes or does not make feedback constructive. Constructive feedback, first of all, requires action items. If your constructive feedback doesn't give your recipient something to take home and apply, it's not constructive. Obviously, no matter what, someone will be capable of taking feedback, good, bad, constructive, etc., and make it into something personal. That's a them issue, not a you issue. Your 1-star Goodreads review that says DNF 38% might have some data for the author, but it's not constructive. If I were in a workshop, I'd be getting side-eyed for saying shit like that. But you can also get side-eyed for constructive feedback, and not all constructive feedback is good. I once wrote a surrealist horror short story for my capstone in undergrad, and a girl started giving me feedback for what she believed to be an adventure story. It was clear that she hadn't read it all the way, or at least not very closely based on some other things she said in her workshop notes, but even though it was bad constructive criticism because it had no alignment with the goals of the piece, it still gave me some important data, like maybe I'm not making it clear enough to the reader right away just what kind of story they're getting into. While people like the unnamed author I mentioned a little bit ago could argue that there's no such thing as a consumer review with constructive feedback in it because the constructing of the piece is already done, my counter argument is that we can also provide and apply constructive feedback to an author and their living body of work. As much as I can say I'm not a fan of Eric LaRocca, this isn't like when you see something that you know is meaningless bullshit and write it off. LaRocca genuinely has glimmers of ideas that I think are great. And the whole reason I can be fueled by straight vitriol reviewing their work is because somehow the ball gets so horrendously fumbled that I now feel invested in LaRocca's growth as an author for my own sake. No matter how biting my reviews get, I do genuinely want LaRocca to improve on these things I'm noticing when I read their books, because I certainly had a time where I fell down similar pitfalls. As a fellow writer, I think it's important to challenge each other, though on a social level, I hope LaRocca never watches one of these reviews. This constructive criticism, first and foremost, is meant as a learning moment for myself, and for you guys watching at home for when you write your next big thing. I'm certain when and I mean when, we are manifesting, thank you, publish my debut novel, there will be someone like me making a similar video, and hopefully other people will learn from me being torn to shreds by a stranger online too. Until then, I think that these quirks of LaRocca's are indicative of something of their own life. While we can apply concepts like death of the author to examining individual pieces of fiction, it's a lot harder to separate art from the artist when you're looking at what is essentially the artist's portfolio. I don't need to know personal details about LaRocca's life. but I'm definitely feeling a little more free to arch my brow at some of the common threads in his body of work, like how skinny, hairless, jacked men are treated like the end-all be-all portrait of masculinity, or how manhood is defined by how and where a man's dick gets used, or how easily topics like sexual violence are introduced as shock value or taboo without ever diving into how sexual violence changes someone psychologically, or for that matter, how often visual and actual language related to kink or polyamory gets brought up without ever acknowledging the amount of checks and balances, boundaries, and responsibility are required for their participants for it to be safe, sane, and consensual. As of late, Eric LaRocca has been publishing a lot of stuff at a breakneck speed, so with all these things in mind, I just hope that LaRocca will slow down and focus more on quality versus quantity going forward. If you recall a bit ago, I pointed out some remarks that Simeon makes about polyamory that I said I would get into in our analysis, and now is that time. I'm going to go ahead now and give a disclaimer here for bias acknowledgements. I am not polyamorous. I don't speak for polyamorous individuals. I have many friends who are polyamorous, and I don't think any one of them has had the same exact experience as the other, just to make matters more complicated. I grew up Catholic, which adds some additional layers because in Catholicism, not only is it, at least according to Rome, one man and one woman, but marriage is for life, you can only divorce if there's cheating or abuse, and you can never remarry. When you marry, your spirits are inextricably bound together unto eternity, and you can't remove the peas from your mashed potatoes when they get mixed together. Obviously, I don't share the views of the Catholic Church as an institution, but those were the messages spoon-fed to me as a child, and you could find that that perspective might show up in my analysis whether I like it or not. Personally, I'm of the belief that no structure of relationship should be enforced by the state. In an ideal world, no government would have its icky paws in what consenting adults do with their love lives. I don't think that monogamy or polyamory are better than one or the other, and I instead think that whatever is best for the person. I've tried polyamory, didn't work for me. I prefer exclusivity, and personally I've never been interested in more than one person at a time, even when I tried real hard to rewire my brain about it. I'm really picky, to be fair though. If we want a truly equitable society for all relationship structures, I simply think that decentralizing marriage as the foundation of households would be more productive than picking one relationship structure or hierarchy over the other, and that societies that support platonic and familial relationships as equal in weight, especially where things like finances, households, and parenting are concerned, it would allow people to be more empowered in deciding their futures and help keep vulnerable people from being more vulnerable because let's say that the person with the most influence over their housing ends up being an abusive sack of shit. In my mind, I view someone's ability to be polyamorous or monogamous, or some secret third thing, to be almost its own orientation with its own cultural elements that are value neutral. We all suffer under patriarchy no matter who or how many people we have in our romantic or sexual lives, and the last thing we need is more people being cops about it. So, that shit from Simeon about polyamory rubbed me the wrong way. On one hand, I've definitely heard queer people, especially younger queer people, or people who haven't met anyone who's like deconstructed about monogamy and still monogamous, say that they feel like the natural state of people is to be polyamorous. For the same reason, there are people who interpret the notion of sexuality being fluid as grounds to say that everyone is at least a little bit bi. Context is important, and it's really easy to point out flaws in sweeping statements like that because they're sweeping statements, and the world is far more complex than what a single sentence can sum up. The institution of marriage is a social construct forcing monogamy being unnatural? Yeah, that's whack. But even then, monogamy has primarily been a tool of patriarchy, with kings and family patriarchs having many mistresses or consorts or concubines as backups in case their first wife couldn't produce a child. In a world where the primary benefits of the institution of marriage have to do with filing a more or less complicated tax form each year and a we sink or swim together double-edged sword on your credit report, of course marriage looks less rosy than it did a couple centuries ago. And even then, it really wasn't rosy so much as it was required if you were a woman that didn't want to spend the rest of her life providing physical comforts to traveling men needing a temporary distraction from their wives waiting for them at home. Monogamy or polyamory? Not the problem. Governments and patriarchy making everyone suffer? Very much the problem. But let's look a little closer at what Simeon has to say. Simeon insists that at the very least, monogamy doesn't exist for queer men, and that sex isn't a divine union like it might be for straight couples, since a blowjob is tantamount to a handshake for his ilk. There's a number of things I take issue with here, and we'll break them down one at a time. First is the notion that queer men are the ones exempt from this since they don't have women to tie them down. What does this mean for lesbians? Second is the notion of casual, more communal, and liberated sexual behaviors making sex less of a quote-unquote divine situation. And third, the notion that this is true of all queer men and that this take, which is very much informed by hookup and cruising culture, is just fact, is a problem too. Now, back to the top. Where do women fit into this? There seems to be some bioessentialist undertones throughout this whole thing, simultaneously demeaning women like Evelyn while also elevating bioessentialist ideas of womanhood or motherhood, like in that broadcast talking about the womb. If we step even further back, because there's literally only Evelyn as our singular female lead in this book, Hema, the dead wife, and At Dark I Become Loathsome is equally reduced to what I feel like is just a mannequin for other characters or larocca to project mommy issues onto. The notion that sexual liberation and the freedom to roam and have as many partners as you want being inherently true of gay men contributes to the bioessentialist notion that masculinity is not just entwined, but synonymous with sex drive, sexual conquest, low empathy, and an incompatibility with domestic life. We see this with Jonathan later being revealed to have no interest in a child with Simeon, wanting to leave Simeon, and pressuring Simeon into incorporating outside sexual partners. We also see this with Simeon, who claims to not feel like a real man, but feels that his lust toward Jonathan is what makes him a real man, and even he is incapable of domesticity and empathy shown through his mistreatment of his ex-wife, his child, and his cheating on Jonathan. Evelyn is treated as simultaneously the gatekeeper to domestic life, being the sole guardian of her and Simeon's son, and also as a gatekeeper to trap Simeon. His history with her sneaks in as a source of Simeon's doubts toward Jonathan, fearing that Jonathan secretly harbored some resentment about Evelyn and Carter's presence in Simeon's life. Women don't fit into this worldview of Simeon's. If he acknowledged where this placed women, we would reveal an underbelly of, in my opinion, misogyny. While it's true that stereotypes like U-hauling cast their shadow over conversations about lesbians, and many people have made jokes at their expense about how long two women need to date before they start getting domestic, the greater shadow cast on them is how patriarchy exploits lesbians for the enjoyment of cishet men. So if it's the natural order of things for men, especially gay men, to have little room for romance and domesticity in order to have a sexual free-for-all, it seems only natural that women in this hypothetical would go the opposite, experiencing bed death the moment the U-Haul gets parked. When descriptions of sexuality become this sweeping, I think it's also important to point out that none of this language takes into account trans people or their relationships with their bodies. While Babyface XOXO or Carter mentions gender being complicated in a chat log and Simeon mentions feeling divorced from manhood because of his relationship to sex, that's the extent of gender talk, and trans people aren't included in the conversation. That in and of itself is shitty, but ultimately not condemnable. But I think they never get mentioned because if they were, a lot of people online would be calling Eric LaRocca a TERF. So in that respect, it was smart not to go down the rabbit hole. I just don't get what the rabbit is doing over here anyway. The next consideration here is this notion that sexual behaviors between gay men, like blowjobs, being as commonplace and communal as a handshake, meaning sex is a less sacred act between two people compared to straight couples, making monogamy less important, or whatever. I want you all to bear with me here, but this is actually a really Protestant evangelical take on human sexuality, but it makes it sound like it isn't to make you want to agree with it. Simeon, or the mind behind him, really needs to deconstruct their relationship to religion and sex. Thank you. The notion of sex being sacred in general is not a new concept, and you can have this feeling and be monogamous, polyamorous, etc. without shitting out what Simeon said. Again, I was raised Catholic. I have grown up surrounded by Protestant evangelicals just as much. Kinda scares me. This idea of sacredness to sex isn't the source of the harmful purity culture that is basically one and the same with patriarchy, rape culture, etc. If anything, I think it's the antidote. From a patriarchal lens, purity culture tells women and girls that their duty sexually is to save themselves for marriage, and once married, be sexually available as much as possible to their husbands to have babies. To a further degree, purity culture will consider all recreational sexual acts to be inherently sinful and to sully the virtue of its participants. But in a patriarchal society where boys will be boys, this fall from grace really only applies to women and girls. In some traditions or denominations, even the use of contraception in the sexual relationship of a married couple is sinful and damaging to the virtue of both parties, which is how you get Irish Catholic families with 10 children. This is also where pro-life rhetoric sneaks its way in, because it's never ever actually been about protecting babies. It's been about protecting the virtue of the girls that got pregnant, but not protecting the girls from anything else, like abuse or anything, just their virtue. The idea that more sex equals less important is just kind of an inversion of that idea. Oh, well, people are having sex like this casually and all the time, so there's less pomp and circumstance. Sure. Simeon might look at that sentence and agree with it, and an evangelical will use that same sentence to explain why gay people are sinful miscreants that will burn in hell. The problem isn't the sex. Simeon's internalized homophobia makes the presence of charged sexuality as a gay man into shameful, stolen exchanges in bathroom stalls and dimly lit alleys. What he wants is what he gets with Porcelain, to a degree. But I don't think that that's the intent of the narrative. What Simeon describes paints gay sexuality as the angel falling from grace. Only straight people have access to monogamy or are capable of it because they are closer to virtue. But because he feels trapped by heterosexuality, his only choice is to fall from grace. And since he sees no virtue in gay sex, in his warped little mind, he sees this as the inevitability of monogamy falling apart. But monogamy isn't virtue, and cheating, pressuring, etc. is not polyamory. The notion of sex as sacred exists in a number of cultures, but I want to point toward ancient Greece. You might be expecting me to point out the Greek god of love Eros, and you're partially right, but if you're like me and you know ball, you'll know that there are two gods named Eros. There's the younger Eros, the child of Aphrodite, who's one of the Erodes, but according to the Orphic mystery cults and Hesiod's Theogony, Eros is another name for Phanes, who emerged fully formed at the dawn of creation. He's also known as Protogonos, Erikapaios, Metis, and some other things. Phanes, or the elder Eros, is still known to be a god of sexuality, especially as he takes the place as a supreme progenitor of all things before him. He also might have both primary sex characteristics, but we're using he for simplicity's sake. In the Orphic cosmogony, Phanes is the binding reproductive force of the early world. But for mystic religions such as the Greek mystery cult, the notion isn't just the mechanics of sex. Love and sex together, or desire, are binding forces of everything. But the Greeks weren't alone in this. The Catholic mystics especially found similar visions, with saints like Hildegard von Bingen going so far as to have visions of the wound in the side of Jesus Christ from the spear of Longinus to be akin to a vulva that she had visions of being birthed out of, and simple prayers such as the Chaplet of Divine Mercy describe the will of God to be love itself. Pair this with other mystics, such as St. Thomas Aquinas and Catherine of Siena, claiming that love is the highest form of knowing, and that God is the presence of love itself. You see where I'm getting? The Venn diagram looks more and more like a circle the longer you stare at it. Sex and love are both forms of alchemy. Nothing that receives or gives love is the same afterward, and the same goes for sex. All alchemy requires something to change from one thing to another, and sometimes on the mundane level, sex does just literally make new things, while love can in other ways, both spiritual and physical, even if it's just the neurotransmitters in your brain. So, the idea that your back alley blowjob is less sacred because it happens more often comes from a scarcity mindset that evangelicals put in your head. Love and sex are sacred because they're the essence of the world. Even people who don't feel sexual attraction or romantic attraction find love somewhere, just in ways that might not look like it does in the mainstream. The universe is eros, therefore you are made of eros. Therefore, you partaking in eros is simply you partaking in yourself, which is alchemy. So miss me with that bullshit. If we want to continue a mystic reading of this, the reason why Porcelain's ritual is lethal and things go wrong isn't because there's something wrong with the astral plane boinking. There was no love in it. Or, if you think about it, consent. Porcelain wearing the spiritual skin of Jonathan to fuck Simeon doesn't leave room for Jonathan to really say no. And Simeon isn't doing any of this because he actually loves the guy. He loves how he made him feel. That isn't to say you need to be in love with someone for sex to be eros in the cosmic sense, but more so in the matter of, is this consensual? Do we have mutual understanding? And even if this is the sexual equivalent of a handshake is still a sign of courtesy, right? Even strangers in an alleyway can tap into the divine. Back to my point though, this entire statement has more to do with internalized homophobia than it has to do with monogamy, full stop. The last part of this is that Simeon writes this like this is true of all queer men, when this take is heavily informed by a pessimistic outlook on cruising and hookup culture, which simply is not the truth of all queer men. And even within that culture, teddy bears are part of hanky code for a reason, damn it. When we step back and look at queer history, it's really not been all that long ago since Stonewall, and rights are already dwindling back down while certain icky people in office make certain icky decisions, and so on and so forth. Hookup and cruising culture stem from a period of time that still kind of exists, where domestic life for gay people, especially queer men and trans people, simply didn't exist. Just because these things have become part of cultural DNA, though, for many, doesn't mean that it's true for all queer men. Especially when cruising and hookup culture also tie a little too well with the sadistic beauty standards of gay men, and not the fun kind of sadistic. Thank you, Bears, for your contributions dismantling the glorification of heroin chic. Polyamory is not the same as having lots of hookups or being promiscuous, and Simeon seems to conflate the two. There's nothing wrong with either, to be clear though. However, Simeon portrays monogamy as being impossible because of him being queer, when in reality polyamory is equally as inaccessible to him because frankly, he's a selfish jerk who mistreats everyone around him. Blaming queerness, however, as the reason for not being able to have a rich romantic life is simply unfair to all parties involved. Homophobia, patriarchy, and all the other social factors leading to the mistreatment of gay people across centuries are the reason. We are given no reason to believe that we are meant to question what comes out of Simeon's narration, so I'm not going to give any benefit of the doubt to LaRocca for this one. I just kind of find it annoying. The last thing here before I drop this dead horse I've been smacking with a meat tenderizer is that overall, the way Simeon talks in this book tells me that he mistakes love and sex. Again, I said this a little earlier, but I don't mean this in the split attraction model way, but love and sex are both eros, and Simeon treats love and sex like they're the same thing, not in the fullness of eros, but in that he only views sex as love. That's why he thinks it's love to boink in the astral plane, and that he can't have any love toward Evelyn because he's not attracted sexually to women, and why his ability to feel worthwhile as a human being is tied to how fuckable he is to strangers in bars. The more you try to detach love from sex and vice versa, in my opinion, the more you actually separate yourself from both of them. Love needn't always be romantic to be sexual, and sex doesn't need to be between romantic partners to be love. Go party, feel closer to the shared experience of the world, and I don't know, have a beverage, partake in communion, yeah? The only character to be deliberately described as having brown skin in Wretch is Porcelain Khaw, whose surname is notably most common in Southeast Asia. However, I want to preemptively give the benefit of the doubt because larocca really likes to leave little Easter egg names they think are subtle, and Khaw is also the last name of Cassandra Khaw, they them, a Bram Stoker award-winning author born in Malaysia, notable for titles such as Breakable Things and Nothing But Blackened Teeth, and most recently The Library at Hellebore, which I'm pretty sure I just butchered. The name choice could simply be a nod at a peer. However, the brownness when paired with other details leaves some side-eyeing to be done. Larocca doesn't make a big effort to give us big descriptions of characters when they're not the protagonist denigrating themselves. Most characters are nondescript, so the choice to include brownness in the description of Porcelain as a man of, quote, medium build and dark complexion, comparing him in the scene of him chained to a grate as either a religious painting or a soon-to-be-executed sinner or a victim of genocide to be paraded around as a trophy or an Italian beggar, is an interesting choice, to say the least. Don't get me started on his name being Porcelain. Again, the Easter egg thing, there's an artist with porcelain in their name that larocca cites in the acknowledgements as of being some inspiration for him. Still looks weird, dude. If you recall, our first full introduction to Porcelain is in the Dream Warriors message board, where the anonymous OP is describing their dream that we learn is Porcelain purchasing Clovis, where he will serve Porcelain in what seems to be some sort of pederasty situation that includes him being covered in strawberry jelly to attract bugs while being paraded about as Porcelain's boy servant in some far-off, arid country the boy's apparently from. He cites this practice as being similar to what was done in ancient Egypt. Clovis is a Germanic name, by the way. The problem here is that larocca really loves to go full fantasy naming syndrome in modern settings, so there are grown men in the year of our Lord 2025 named Simeon, like the second-born son of Jacob and Leah in the Old Testament, or the man who blessed baby Jesus in Jerusalem in the New Testament. Take your pick. That's Simeon. Biblical names aren't uncommon in general, but Simeon isn't common among them, and we don't really know where Clovis is from. So here's the thing. Remember in the second video on this channel when we discussed The Men by Sandra Newman, and we discussed how orientalism factored into the description of the main character's groomer? This is like that, but taken to the nth degree. As a refresher, Orientalism is a term coined by the late Palestinian-American critic Edward Said to describe the way that Western society portrays non-Western society, or the Orient, as savage, backwards, mystical, immoral, and strange. The Orient is portrayed as being stuck in the past or stuck in tradition, and real religious ideas or cultural practices are sensationalized or elevated for Western consumption. Orientalist stereotypes of men portray them as simultaneously effeminate or weak, while also posing a significant threat to moral order, subjugating women, especially white women, and having a criminal or savage cruelty to them. The East is portrayed heavily sexualizing women, portraying them as part of harems, or luring white men away to conquer them. Porcelain lives in exuberant wealth, enough to be buying children for his own gratification, as well as to do what could be achieved by lighting a citronella candle. Despite having this power, he is simultaneously feminized in many ways. Clovis tells us he met him when he was working as a prostitute, though he then says in the next page that he met him because of the jelly arrangement. Porcelain is described as being, quote, too excited to be used by Clovis, and says some people are born to be used. Their only purpose in this world is to serve others. This is in reference to the services Porcelain provides outside of sexual favors. He slowly, over time, developed the ability to channel the dead, though this is only ever described as Porcelain's quote-unquote power. When learning Porcelain used to be a prostitute, despite having just paid Porcelain to channel his dead husband so he could fuck his ghost, Simeon says it, quote, feels especially sour to recognize the fact that Porcelain was once a prostitute, especially since he appeared so sophisticated, so elegant tonight when he first met him, which, 1, doesn't really track given he was chained to a grate, 2, these things are not mutually exclusive and says more about Simeon's thoughts on sex workers than anything else, and 3, he says that the arrangement Porcelain made with Clovis is similar to a whore and a pimp. Again, also weird given that Clovis is Porcelain's servant, not the other way around, but whatever. Porcelain gets compared to a drug, and Simeon says he yearns to be destroyed by, quote, all the wonders, all the enchantments he can possibly show him. Larocca is trying so hard to recapture the we have such sights to show you of it all in Hellraiser, but Clive Barker, he is not. Additionally, the souls consumed by Porcelain, the little silver beetles, evoke the image of a scarab, which I'm certain most of you are aware of, has great cultural significance in Egypt and ancient Egyptian religion. The entirety of Porcelain's character is defined by sexuality, foreignness, and danger, while the climax of this book is his subjugation by a white man. He represents what Simeon views simultaneously as backward and the object of his desires. In many ways, because Simeon relishes in topping as a manifestation of his masculinity as a gay man, Simeon topping Porcelain places Porcelain in the same position Orientalism stereotypes women of Southwest Asia as, which is that they are exotic, sensual fantasies to be conquered by white men. His placement as a devourer of souls harkens back to mythologies of the siren. It's Porcelain's fault, to Simeon, that Simeon was driven to take advantage of Porcelain. Porcelain's mystical powers to channel the dead are exclusively portrayed as done through sex when someone wanting a reunion with a dead loved one doesn't inherently mean fucking them, though that's clearly what's on Simeon's mind. All things considered, Porcelain as a big bad is really meek. Porcelain didn't even, if you really think about it, kill Simeon. He violated Porcelain. Clovis is still part of the picture in some ways where we can't paint Porcelain as entirely innocent, but if we're just talking Simeon and Porcelain, this is like a sex worker being assaulted when they tell a repeat customer no. Simeon literally says he won't take no for an answer when he goes to see Porcelain the third time. On his third visit, Simeon says he, quote, can't help but think of Porcelain as some wretched prostitute, some miserable panhandler on the cramped streets of a foreign city, deceiving tourists with decaying rituals of magic and woeful showmanship. Hello? There are so many groups of brown people he could be stereotyping right now. My first thought, though, is that Porcelain Khaw could be coded as Romani based on this description. Much like our discussion in our first Eric LaRocca review, with the understanding I'm risking being that friend that's too woke, I think this book would have immediately been clocked as having an unchallenged racist stereotype in it if Porcelain were a cis woman. Tell me I'm wrong. But because this is a book about a gay man, and Porcelain is a man, more importantly one who codes as a brown demon twink, I don't think anyone is looking twice. If by some chance you're not familiar with the Roma or Romani people, it's probably because you've only known them by their slur, which starts with a G, ends with a Y, and a woman convicted for murdering her mother with the last name Blanchard has it as her first name. No, I'm not saying it out loud because frankly, I don't wanna. They're an Indo-Aryan ethnic group considered to be originally from the Indian subcontinent. The Roma have historically been persecuted pretty much everywhere, from enslavement in Romania to forced assimilation in the Austrian Empire, and their inclusion in the Holocaust, being killed alongside the Jewish people, and so on. They've not exactly had a great time. And now, Romani people still face discrimination, erasure, and life in the shadow of harmful stereotypes that have unfortunately stood the test of time, associated with having mystical powers, especially fortune telling, criminal habits, and sharp tempers. See where I'm getting at? By having Porcelain just be a nondescript brown man who learned to channel the dead while making a living as a sex worker, and then essentially continuing said sex work but with special mystical undertones and a bunch of essentially scarabs containing the souls of his victims, I'm not making any conclusions about Larocca, his intentions, or even this book per se, but my reading of this book really makes me side-eye. This is why it's a mistake to have an admitted fan, and Larocca mentions this in his acknowledgements, as your editor, and why if you're writing in genres like horror where you're likely to get into sensitive subject matter, you should hire a professional sensitivity reader. Or at the very least maybe invest some time in being a wee bit more socially aware instead of cranking out an under-edited book every 9 months. If it weren't for Clovis being Porcelain's indentured servant, honestly, there'd be no reason to even see Porcelain as evil or even scary. Even when Simeon is reaching into Porcelain's stomach, Porcelain is doing this only after Simeon stabbed him in the neck with a hairpin. Arguably, consuming Simeon after this could be considered self-defense. Simeon is a scary one. He's ultimately self-centered, self-serving, and uses everyone around him for his own ends, and doesn't care for the negative impact he has on others. His clinging to the memory of his dead husband isn't out of love, but because his husband isn't there to stroke his frail ego. So of course, the insecure white man would assault the brown man he paid to have sex with, mystical workings aside, when he finally said no. In this particular situation at least, I'm a Porcelain defender. Get his ass. None of this to say, by the way, that Porcelain being described with this arrangement of traits is inherently racist. There's a reality in which I could see this portrayal being rewritten to expose Simeon for his attitude toward Porcelain, or there being room for commentary on how clients are being snapped up through the allure Orientalist stereotypes have for uncritical Western eyes. This is not that intellectual of a book, though, no matter how overwritten it is, and I have complete faith that no effort of the sort was made to tell that kind of story. For today's final verdict, Wretch, or the Unbecoming of Porcelain Khaw, gets 2 stars, nestling safely into our certified stinker category. Wretch was undeniably better than the first Eric LaRocca book we reviewed on this channel, At Dark I Become Loathsome. However, when the bar is that far in hell, that doesn't mean much. Bad is bad. Wretch was overwritten to hell and back, much like its predecessor. Where it didn't quite have the same structural issues as At Dark I Become Loathsome, it made up for it by not fully seeing through its concepts, like the Wretches group, or Porcelain, or that really awful, stupid twist at the end, and by having equally flimsy characters, and a protagonist that's basically just a reskinning of Ashley Luton, and of course the unintentional, or at least I'm hoping unintentional racism. I wouldn't recommend this book in good faith to anyone. There are books out there with similar concepts that execute it better and are more respectful. However, if you're a spiteful little shit like me, I think you'll have fun hate reading it. As always, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this, or even if you didn't, make sure to like this video and leave a comment with your thoughts, any books you'd like to see me review next. We've got a few that are in the works right now, or just to let me know that you've made it all the way to the end, tell me if you've ever had a paranormal experience before. I grew up in a rural area where there was a lot of spooky stuff going on, and apparently my brother saw a nun, hovering over my crib several times when I was a baby. That's probably why I'm like this. We shoot to upload at least once a month with a new book review, so make sure to subscribe and ring the bell to get notifications for whenever the next one comes out. Otherwise, my cats are going to learn how to haunt the ghost of this YouTube channel, and every single image of me is going to be replaced with 10,000 scarabs.